Welcome to the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce.
The Falmouth Chamber is dedicated to working on behalf of our members to make Falmouth a better place to live, work, and conduct business. We are committed to developing the economic, cultural, educational, and civic interests of our community and welcome the support from all organizations to achieve our combined goals. Whether you call Falmouth home, are a summer resident, or a visitor, we hope you take advantage of all that the Chamber has to offer.
People think that a locally owned and operated appliance store may not offer what they need. Actually, we have trained and dedicated sales associates, expert delivery and installation, professional repair service, and personal customer service. Plus, we have access to a huge local warehouse with over 6,000 models in stock. Crane Appliance. We call the Cape and Islands home. Carlson Printing for all your printing needs. 508-548-7303 or toll free at 1-800-696-7303. Our email address is carlsonprinting@aol.com. Carlson Printing for all your printing needs.
Hosting services for fctv.org are provided by MegaNet Communications. MegaNet offers a wide array of internet services including Mega Backup Cloud Service, server colocation, T1, fiber, Metro Ethernet, as well as telephone services such as hosted PBX and digital voice. Their number one goal is to keep your communications network up and running and allow you to focus on growing your business. 877-634-2638 or meganet.net.
With the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board. I'm going to call the Board of Selectmen meeting to order. I don't know if you, Madam Chair, if you need to.
And I will call the Planning Board meeting to order.
Excellent. If we could just rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and thank you to some of the other members of the staff from the town that are here tonight to be part of this important conversation. I just wanted to say thank you to start to Patricia Kerfoot and to the Planning Board for suggesting and working back and forth over some of these discussion topics and really just kind of, you know, culling them down to something that we can speak about meaningfully, so we're not just touching upon a bunch of different subjects, but really have hopefully an in-depth discussion about transportation and traffic, which is something that this board, and I know the Planning Board, you know, we continue to really struggle with it. Every summer, it seems like it's the, you know, the hot issue, and then we make it through the summer and we sort of forget about it for a little while. But really an important time to have this conversation. And then also to just look a bit more at the issue of housing, which again is something that so many different groups are trying to work on It remains a really entrenched challenge to look at affordable housing for our community that is so needed. But certainly, we're going to do a little bit of work tonight, looking at some of those issues related to housing, and hopefully coming up with some future action items for these two boards to pursue. So I don't know if you wanted to start off with the question that you had posed about who is in charge of transportation policies and decisions, and just give a sense of maybe what importance you put behind that
Well,
question.
when we were discussing it, nobody knew who made decisions. And that's a lot of what happens, because that group has that part, and that group has that part, and there's little coordination of what's going on. And so a lot of these came out of this discussion that we had. That was really Paul Dreyer's concern, transportation too, because we used to have a transportation management committee. And that went away a number of years ago. And then, what now? Who makes those decisions? How are they made? And what I'm talking about is more on the policy level, because you have to have some entity that makes the policies that other boards can then make happen. So that's why this is on here, and that's why that question, who is in charge of transportation policies and decisions?
So, and I had talked a little bit about with Julian and Peter when we first got your draft, and it's a great question, because it's actually a pretty loaded question, because there's lots of folks who touch upon this issue. And I don't know, Peter, Julian, do you want to just sort of name we were kind of brainstorming the different entities that sort of out of town and beyond that touch upon this issue of transportation, which is, it's a lot of folks.
Well, there are a lot of folks, and I guess represented by the multiple committees. Certainly the committee to which Pat just referred, the Transportation Management Committee, which has been essentially ceased to function but is still in place. We have some background information with the board packet. There's an active Traffic Advisory Committee that's been active for many, many years and continues to function on, I would guess, be best described as less than policy decisions, but really enacting decisions and determinations based on inquiries and founded in policy set by the Board of Selectmen. Obviously, the Bikeways and Pedestrian Committee, the Historical Commission has played a role in transportation issues, as has importantly, the Disability Commission as well. And those are just sort of a sampling. I think historically in this community, and I think in many others in the Commonwealth, in terms of the final decision-making, the selectmen function as the roadway commissioners. In some other communities, it goes in a different direction, but fundamentally, the responsibility and determination lies here with the board in that regard.
And we had talked a little bit about the kind of complicating all of that is that you're also working with the state, as we are, right in the midst of right now. So even when you have sort of a great citizen advisory committee put something together, I mean, at the end of the day, even if this board thinks it's, just an incredible work product, the state still, has that approval. So, certainly a complex, sort of a complex layering. But I think to get to Pat's point of sort of at that local level, setting those policies, that it is something that we did have this, we do. It's still, it hasn't been eliminated, but the Falmouth Transportation Management Committee hasn't been active for a really long time. Yeah, I don't know if anyone can remember back, but.
I can't. I remember sort of when it disappeared, because there was a lot of heartburn that certain advice was not being taken. But it shouldn't have stopped there. It should have been some discussion instead of, the fight about it. And so my real question is, as Julian said, the ultimate decision lies with the Board of Selectmen. But wouldn't it make your lives a lot simpler if you had a coordinating subcommittee, if you will? It could be an appointed subcommittee, not necessarily of selectmen, who would investigate and report to you various options. And touch base with all of these different committees. Wouldn't that make your life a lot easier? That's where I'm leading.
Yep, Peter, and then anybody else? Charlotte, sorry. Because Charlotte had her hand
Yeah,
up.
go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to just comment that it's tremendously entangled, and it would appear that the state really has more say than anybody. And here regionally, it's the Cape Cod Commission, and within the Cape Cod Commission, they've got a subgroup whose name I can't remember.
They have their own
That's
transportation.
their transportation thing, and then they have authority over the money that the state awards to them, and they make plans for it on a multi-year basis. And they already have a plan for a multi-year basis to spend that money. And looking at what the plan is, you think, wow, why isn't our share bigger? So part of it's the funding and getting things done, and if we wanted to look at the representation of Falmouth getting to that money question, because, you know, between the state money and this money flowing through that commission with them making decisions, that will be most of the money going into transportation. And if we look at what they're planning from now till 2023, Falmouth gets new signs. Other people are getting roads, and it's nice to have new signs, but you think, gee, other communities are doing better and historically have done better, and I wonder if there's some history behind that.
Sue and then Peter? Sorry, Peter, I'm just gonna.
Sure. So part of the Selectmen's strategic planning, several years ago, I brought up transportation. It's kind of been a bugaboo of mine for many, many years, and that's in part where the community development position idea came out, where the Selectmen were looking for some kind of coordination, where we don't look at transportation issues in a vacuum, by project, where there's some kind of really policy development that developers come to the Transportation Committee, for example, so that there is a town-wide policy and coordination, because it fits right into the Davis Straits and all of the planning that you've been doing, because a lot of that, congestion slows people and hampers people from their jobs. So in terms of economic development and climate change, they all meet at transportation, whether you're biking, whether you're having, driverless cars, whether you're looking at the CCRTA that Sam represents. I think it's a great idea that the planning board brings up, to have a body that coordinates all of these things rather than kind of piecemealing it. So I really like the idea. I think it's something that we have been talking about in strategic planning, and the step of actually going back to have it in one place, I think is a great idea.
Well, it would appear that the policies that we have already in the local comprehensive plan, they really nest very well with what the state's major issues are, what the Cape Cod Commissions are, so that policy-wise, we're in good shape. That's sort of at a very macro, where the birds fly level. It's bringing it down to earth where we've got a problem and they've got the money.
Peter, I know
Yes, the conversation has really sort of begun to go in a direction that I was going to sort of ask about, which is, the issue is obviously is so massive, and is it policy formulation that we feel like is the gap, or is it more on the capital planning? Is it regulation of traffic, and it's beginning to sound more like the concerns that I'm hearing from the planning board is more about improvements of infrastructure and spending and capital planning. That is it, if it's that level, and I just, whatever it is, I guess I think it's important to try to narrow the scope a little bit so that we can talk about what's the best way to address it, whether it's a committee, whether it's staff reporting to the selectmen, staff reporting to the planning board, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so it just seems like we just need somebody that's in the driver's seat, because we've talked about the complete streets, and we all seem to agree we like the concept, but I don't think we've officially adopted it yet. I don't know what that barrier is. And then, we had requested a report from DPW about planned roadway improvements, and Peter gave us a great report about all the different projects that are on the future board. But it would also be good to have a committee that's following up, you know, checking on the timeline and keeping track of the progress and how we're shaping up with that. And then as far as new initiatives, like in line with the Complete Streets, personally, I drive down Thomas Landers Road almost every day, and I see a lot of avid bikers out there. I think it would be very easy to put a couple of feet of pavement on each side just to give them a safe place to travel. It might not be the greatest place to invite people, but it's just a practical thing that we should probably be doing. And if we had a committee, maybe they'd be looking at that instead of, you know, having it just kind of sit.
I mean, I don't know if you want to call on anybody from there. Pam or
Anybody?
Charlie?
Yeah, Pam.
So
Jump in.
I think there is sort of a multi-level of transportation. I think you have sort of town-wide, year-round transportation, and then I think you have the nightmare of the summer transportation, where everyone tries to get into a parking lot at one of the beaches. I live a little more than a mile from Old Silver, and unless we leave our house to drive that mile to park, by 8:30, 8:45 during the summer, there is no parking. And so there are solutions, because I think we need a shuttle service that can go through the hotel areas, the condo areas, pick people up and have a shuttle service that you pay maybe $1. So there is some monetary reward for those people that take the trolley or whatever we have. And then, to me, we also have a public health issue, where you have idling, you have dangerous streets to ride your bikes on. All those things, I mean, I think it isn't unidimensional. I think it's just so multifaceted. And because of the community we are, which is a resort community basically, I think those 3 months of the year, 2.5 months of the year, are very different, where we can't, I know we've talked about, could some of the Woods Hole buses stop and pick people up en route to wherever they're going? But I think it's much broader, and I think the Board of Health may even have input into what can we do for health and safety issues in town.
Charlotte?
If we could just go back I think those are good points. If we could just go back for a moment to the issue about the committee and Complete Streets. Actually, I didn't realize we needed another step to adopt Complete Streets, because it's already in the local comprehensive plan, which we, of course, that's our Bible. So we thought it was perhaps a town policy already, and we were acting on it. And what we're missing is the more nuts and bolts issue. I'm part of the Ray Jacks fan club, and I think that he's very on top of it. And I saw him in action when he was doing the shepherding for the Route 28A work going on between the administration building and Oxbow. He knows Complete Streets backwards and forwards. He's all for smart growth. He's very much on board. I think that he's really keeping track of it. He'll put in those bigger sidewalks anywhere he gets the money. It's more having an advocacy group assisting with that effort. I think our policies are pretty good. It's more that middle part that you were talking about, Peter, that the committee, if I had my say, that the committee would focus on, is making the connection and bringing maybe a microphone to it, so that at the point that the planning is done for the capital planning, it would get better connected to those things.
If we read the mission statement and the makeup of what was the Transportation Management Commission that still exists on the books, we just haven't appointed people, it makes perfect sense for us to jump right into it, advertise the openings for the next 30 days, and reappoint that committee. I mean, it really is being charged to exactly what everyone has here said, and give them that power. It has a representative from the Planning Board, a representative from the Historical Commission, a representative from Bikeways, 4 people at large, and then we have the charge already put in place that needs to get done.
And maybe DPW's support. They're the guys with the expertise.
Well, we can't appoint them to a committee, but we can be a non-voting support member of it, certainly.
Doug, the charge that's in place, though, how much authority does it have? Because I think what I'm hearing also is almost like ferreting out and helping to make decisions, getting a lot of background information and pulling it all together.
The only authority they could have is to advise to the Board of Selectmen. They can't be given the authority to make decisions.
I understand that, but do they have the authority to ferret out all this information?
That's
on
what
which
I read
to
the mission
make-
statement, it does.
Pardon?
The way I read the mission statement, they're
Okay.
supposed to work with all the, both the
Okay.
boards and relevant committees to get the information and then make recommendation based on it in a way that this board would not be able to do.
I mean, I think their charge is a hefty one. I mean, it's, you know, when you look at what it's asking to do, I mean, it's, you know, it's taking into that, obviously looking at that, the LCP, it's working with various town boards, committees, departments, it's to keep the Board of Selectmen, town administrator informed about transportation policies, state and federal level, foster communications with our 3 bordering towns, and to coordinate actions of the various boards and committees around transportation. So, I mean, it's a pretty significant sort of scope of, you know, influence and work that they're charged with doing. So I think it's, you know, I agree that I see it as, we're not asking them to just, I mean, every committee has a pretty significant thing. We're asking them to work on that topic and advise the board, you know, with their level of expertise. But this is, you know, in the sense that this really crosses so many different levels, that they are really coordinating with a lot of different committees and boards.
However, my vague memory, and I may be mistaken on this, was they were being asked to do so much, it was hard for us to get 7 people willing to apply for it. And so it died out just because we didn't have membership in it, not because we didn't want it done. But again, this, I think, was over 8 to 10 years ago, when there just weren't enough people willing to take on all the tasks that are put forward to it.
I think one of the reasons it fell apart too is it was a group that was kind of working on its own and didn't really have a whole lot of guidance. And then when they would come up with something, nothing was done about what they were. And we had a member of the board who just got frustrated with it like everybody else, and they all just quit. So I don't think it was a matter of too much work. I think it was a matter of they didn't feel they were being listened to. And I think it was due to the fact that they were just this committee that was just charged with come up with what you think you need to come up with and throw it at the wall and see what sticks, and nothing seemed to stick. And I think if we have a committee, reconstitute that, and they are working with the planning board and the Board of Selectmen, I think what they come up with and that they do the research and all that might have more teeth to it this time.
And it might be nice to give, sorry, this is like my blind spot, so just yell out if you, but it might be nice for planning and Board of Selectmen to sort of think about, you know, an initial task, right? So, and it's rather than saying, oh, here's transportation and traffic, go and come up with solutions. That's really broad, maybe not very effective. But if we look at something like, say we start with something like shuttle or parking on main, you know, some kind of discrete thing that we're asking for some feedback on, and just to try to be a little bit more directive, so that when they come back, it's something that is relevant and we're all thinking about it and we've asked them to look into it.
And something that they've been directly tasked to do.
Exactly, and not asking them to just sort of, in a general sense, collect a whole bunch of information.
And we promise to do what they say,
Right.
effectively, but
And one of the ways that could have a practical implication is if we do look at the mission statement, which I agree has a nice breadth to it, but I think there could be a benefit to looking at development through transportation management as one element. For example, and I'm sure town planner can tell us more about it, but when larger developments are proposed, I certainly think it's crucial to look at the implication on traffic. That's something that affects the entire neighborhood, something that affects, you know, a lot of development down the road. Just the way we look at, you know, our sewer capacity. We have a policy for priorities with our sewer capacity. It's the same thing with our roads. I mean, Mr. Jack will tell us they were built when cars were smaller. There are issues about parking that come up. That really impacts the merchants and the vitality of Main Street. So we're looking, the Chamber of Commerce was looking at a parking garage structure. I think these things, good planning, I certainly think you know far better than I do, has to do with looking at the way all of this intersects, and that makes it move a lot smoother. So I would like that element to be perhaps added here
Something that they
in
look
some
at.
way.
I wonder if it would be possible to remind the oncoming Transportation Committee that we already have plans. They don't really need new plans. They need to meet with the people who have already been assigned responsibilities and see how the priorities are being set, and see if they agree with those priorities, because there are a lot of them. You can't do them all, so it'd be priority setting, but not forgetting that we already have the plans. What we lack is, an impetus for implementation and sort of a regard for the plans that we have. Or say, these aren't good plans, throw them out, start over. But not to just move on like they didn't exist.
So Megan?
Yep, and then Paul.
So one thing we might want to consider, even though their mission statement is good, it's a town administrator appointed committee, which can be kind of, not as well organized sometimes. And then,
No, it's appointed by us.
pardon me?
It's appointed by the Board of Selectmen.
Well, it says traffic advisory, traffic advisory, excuse me, I mixed that up. We might want to consider though, 5 people instead of 7, so it's a little more easy to function.
And then we would have to, we'd have to either, so if there's one from planning, one from historical, one from bikeways, that's 3. So then, bless you, it would be 2 at large. Is that what we're saying?
I think they were thinking 7
outweighs.
was to have the at-large.
At-large outweigh the appointed, right? But it's a point well taken that the larger the committee gets, sometimes the harder it is to fill it and keep it filled, but
And
we
come
could
to
see,
consensus too on things.
but we could certainly see if we can get the.
Megan, how important would it be, though, to have a member of the Board of Selectmen and a member of the Planning Board?
Selectmen's not on it.
We're not on there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought
It's just planning. So, I mean, that would be up to, I think
We
the
can't
other
do
way
it.
to do it, not for us, but I'm just saying the other way to do it is to have there be a liaison where maybe you're not a voting member, but you're advising and I think the goal clearly when this was done is to have that communication because of exactly what Charlotte's pointing out. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Planning board is working on these issues all of the time, so it makes sense for them to be involved in this. But it wouldn't have to be a voting member necessarily. I mean, if we were trying to make the number a bit smaller, but.
Because what I would be looking for is people, I think, who are a little bit more passionate, and focused in solving the traffic problems as best they can and coordinating with other groups too as to what's going on. So I think you're going to be wanting people with a little bit more focus than any of us who are focused on planning.
I would see
issues.
our members as a non-voting advisory
Right.
member of the board.
Paul and then Pam?
I think this committee is pretty important, and I'd just like to point out a couple of things. Last year, I saw a cigarette boat coming down Main Street, 50-foot long, trying to go to McDougal's. They don't belong on Main Street. And even local people. I've seen a Cavosa dump truck filled with debris coming down Main Street. Falmouth Lumber has lumberyard. They're not delivering on Main Street. So somehow we have to get the wayfaring out and tell people you're not coming down Main Street with these kinds of vehicles. Parking is an issue, clearly. In the summertime, there's at least 2 or 3 trucks on Library Lane unloading, walking across Main Street, and going into the back of Main Street for deliveries to several places over there. There's room behind those buildings for deliveries. They shouldn't be parking there. I've seen a truck in front of the furniture store on Main Street, stopping traffic and just delivering right there because they didn't want to get out of the way. But there are others that do well. They go in the back of Ace Hardware and deliver that way. So there are people that know how to do it, but it is a wayfaring issue, getting people off the roads. There's also a timing issue. Maybe we need to restrict deliveries at certain times a year to certain periods of time. That would go a long way for doing it. These are not expensive solutions. There may be some land taking that might ease some of this delivery that you might want to look at. But I think it's important to reconstitute this committee. But it needs some technical expertise as well, not just a bunch of people who do not have a lot of experience on doing the planning and doing the transportation studies. We have a lot of information here, but we really need to implement it in a proper fashion.
I think also what's the key to their success will be their ability to interact with the DPW, because sometimes you might come up with a plan that's, sounds great, but then it has responsibilities with it. And if we jump into complete streets, which I think was a caution that we heard from Ray Jack when we were thinking about complete streets. He says, I think he cautioned us about be careful what you sign up for, because there's commitments when you sign up for things, and the state will follow up and say, are you guys really doing these things? So you have to coordinate what your goals are and make sure they're practical.
And the last sentence of the statement does give the Board of Selectmen the authority to appoint non-voting members who are from our staff, who have the technical expertise to be able to support that. I think this would be a time that would be appropriate to at least have one or two people who are professional street people to be involved in it. I think also the interest out there right now in transportation and parking issues is high enough, we would have no difficulty getting people appointed to this committee.
I agree. I don't really see the need at this point to change the number necessarily, because frankly, I think you're gonna find four at-large individuals who are going, yes, easily, who are going to want to be committed and, really work on that issue, because we've named just a few of them. I mean, wayfaring is one, the shuttling for, this particularly in the summertime to beaches and to shopping. I mean, that's another, looking at this issue of how do we, there's always an issue with parking. We're always struggling with parking on Main Street and in Woods Hole. It's something that, we deal with every single year, and frankly, a lot of resources, our police chief is here, a lot of our town resources go to trying to solve those problems, solve some of those parking issues, deal with some of those issues that we see, particularly on Main Street in Woods Hole, and as we knew as we dealt with this summer, near the beaches. That was just kind of a consistent challenge where we had officers at beaches trying to manage parking. That's not a great use, that's my opinion, I'm just speaking for myself, but that is not a great use of our workforce and the funds to be able to, we're looking for public safety, and just sort of regularly having to manage traffic at beaches, we should be able to do better with that. That's, crowded beaches is not a new problem for our town. So I think those there's just a few things there that a group of people could dive right into, never mind when they start to look at some of these more maybe kind of long-term, some of the things that are already in the LCP as we look forward towards future development. But there are some kind of in our face right at the moment issues. Never mind that we're having some great redevelopment that's happening here on Main Street and then further through town that really touches upon a lot of these issues, including pedestrian and bike safety. And that, it's nice to have somebody kind of constantly looking at that as a whole picture. So, yeah.
The only other person I would think it might be appropriate, whether we put that in writing or not, would be someone from the Disabilities Commission.
Mm-hmm.
I just think their access to transportation is also important to keep in mind in this committee.
Yeah,
good point.
That's a good point. It wasn't on there previously. So, any other thoughts about this particular? I think the sentiment sounds pretty favorable to advertising for this committee and getting it reconstituted, and just maybe creating, it might be nice for, if planning at your next meeting or sort of wants to think about what charge, one or two things that we might want to think about giving as a specific charge that we can direct once we have this group together, direct them towards in the short term.
Are we looking at 5 voting members?
What do folks think?
I don't think there's much of a reason to change it. I think with, a lot of folks here have schedules that take them out of state off and on, and, I think we're better to have 4 at-large brains going rather than to narrow it.
Rob, why did you think the planning board member shouldn't be a voting member?
Oh, I'd like to get more of the community people involved as opposed to board members. I thought that committee that worked on the Route 28 section up by the administration building, I thought that was a great group.
Right, but again, since they're going to be implementing the LCP, to guarantee we have someone for the planning board there who can really remind them, once again, this is, as Charlotte was saying, hey, we don't need to talk about this. That's been talked about for 10, 15 years. We have this in writing, and just keep them focused, I think would be so important. Yeah. I'd rather have them actually at least feel like they have the authority of being a voting member as someone who's just a liaison.
I think you have an opportunity to do multiple things. You could phase this and have 2 phases going at one time. Maybe shuttle and the parking issues in downtown Falmouth, especially during the summer. I've seen some horrific accidents and near accidents because I go to headlines, and trying to get a parking place there in the morning, any time of day, But when you see a huge truck stop and start to unload in the main road, and a biker trying to navigate around, I mean, it's like a death knell. I just sort of hear it. But I think if you started and said, we're gonna start with 2 phases, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do this, because if I were interested in joining a board and I saw the massive amount of work that the Transportation Committee was going to endeavor to fix, I wouldn't go anywhere near it. But I
Yes,
think-
you would, Pam. You'd be the first person filling out the application, but I mean, I understand your point.
No, we don't want to scare people off.
Yeah.
And, you know, people here are, you know, 70s, 80s. You know, we need to really go into some of the communities and get some people under 60, or at least under 70. But I think there's a way to do this that doesn't frighten people off, because, I'm sorry, am I?
No, you just need any very smaller group you can pull from.
We're down to 30%, I think, when we're looking at that population. But anyway, I
Yeah.
just think if you pick 2 of the main topics, 2 areas that we could address, I don't think a shuttle is an onerous position to take to set something up, nor do I think, although I don't know, about the offloading of materials on Main Street, but just that in and of itself is enormous. So I just think we should break it up and say, anyone interested in phase 1 and 2, and then we'll try to hit up, you know, some other people for phase 3 and 4. I just think if you have everybody working on everything, it's not,
Start with the low-hanging fruit.
exactly.
You do.
Right.
Sam, and then
Yeah, I
Charlie?
want to just say that transportation is complex. And to expect the average citizen to just jump into a committee and have the experience and expertise and perspective is asking a lot. So I think having staff support to kind of provide background and guidance, and sort of coaching, if you will, is going to be essential. And that group that met for the 28, you know, design had that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it went well, because, you know, they got some coaching along the way, and then it was a question of how do you do the compromises, and what, you know, what kind of parameters do you have to work within. So I just want to suggest that we really should be thinking about staff support of this committee, because it is complicated, and it's complicated no matter where you live. So I don't want us to make this sound like it's this easy task with an easy problem that we could hand off to a committee and they could figure it all out on their own. Most people don't have that background. I don't.
Charlotte?
I would hope the charge to the committee would include a schedule that would say they were going to report at a time that definitely connects to the planning for the capital plan of each year, so that there's time for the people responsible for the capital plan to have heard them out and to have worked with them to see how much they're going to put into the next year's, the year after that, so that there's a definite way that they'll get some input. Is this going to be implemented or not? And if so, when? And you know when you're going to hear from them. Makes it more real.
Good point.
The other thing I'd like to see, oh, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
to see encouraged is, it's called thinking outside the box. Okay, fine, whatever you want to call it. But just because it's always been this way doesn't mean it should continue this way. And what brought this up to me, it was like, dong, our son came out to visit this summer, and I told him the problems and how there's going to be a path around the pond there coming onto Main Street, and that's hoping to be developed better. He said, well, this is a no-brainer. You bring the parking from the school back where the playing fields are, and the playing fields out towards the street, so that you encourage parking there so that they can walk into town. And you have little signs encouraging them to walk into town. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Just because the playing fields and the parking have always been there where they are, doesn't mean that they have to continue to be there. And I'd love to see people who are a little bit creative like that.
That's a good point. Who are focused in on that. Yep, Doug?
Are we pretty much set on the committee?
I think so. I mean, I think unless anybody else has anything about the committee.
I just have a different topic I just wanted to mention while we're here, because this might not be something for the committee, is the fact that we've got so many private roads in town that are deteriorating rapidly, and there's a list of, a waiting list of people waiting to have their roads taken. It's 10 or 12 years long. And I think that's a part of transportation that should be dealt with. I don't know if that's a committee job, or that's something that we should try to think about ourselves as a funding issue. And also, I'm curious if the planning board is now being more strict with the approvals of subdivisions, that roads will be built to standards that the town could take. And are they town roads, or are there still private roads and private developments?
Private.
Because we're just digging ourselves a hole. We let more and more of those happen. Eventually, they want to come in, and it just creates a barrier for people.
Well, the process changed recently, though. I don't know if you want to let staff, sorry.
Well, we've simplified it from the standpoint of coordinating it through engineering. Our town engineer, Jim McLaughlin, oversees it, working with the Deputy Public Works Director and the Public Works Director as well, and also other members of the staff. And Peter and I have had several meetings with them. We've developed a list, and we've tried to streamline the standards. At the end of the day, it is still a very long list, but when we get the periodic inquiries now, we direct them to the right individual, and they're apprised of the process to basically get in the queue and be prepared to do the kinds of things in their neighborhood to facilitate that moving forward.
And do you have any ideas of how we can expedite that list more quickly than, is it a funding?
Put more money into it.
Funding, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, the challenge is that we're limited in-house in how much work we can take on and how many roads in-house. So that to go beyond that, we really would need to contract out that kind of road improvement and construction. One of the benefits of doing it in-house is there's greater control on costs. Once we begin to contract out, the cost of those neighborhoods is likely to increase. But that's the price of speeding things up, essentially.
Tom, did you want to make a comment?
I was just going to say that historically, in my years in working with planning boards, whether a road was going to be public or private, we've always maintained that they be developed to that standard. And even if there's a provision in the bylaw, in some decision, whether it's a ZBA decision or something else that says this road to remain private in perpetuity, it doesn't stop someone from petitioning their government to ask that it be accepted. So in the most recent case of the subdivision we're working in now, we wanted to make sure the roads are done properly and made sure those inspections are in place. So they're going to last for as long as they're going to last. And I would venture to say a majority of the roads that we see people asking for street acceptances are those roads that have used their serviceable life, and now they've got an issue and they want to give it to somebody else. So we've tried to make sure, and I've only been here a short period of time, but the one opportunity we've had, we wanted to make sure that road is constructed per the spec, and to make sure there aren't issues for the owners in a generation or so in the future.
And I think one of the challenges that we've seen when folks have brought this issue before, have asked this board, is that by the time that useful life of the road has sort of come and gone, usually the folks who started that, or were initially the folks who lived in that development, don't live there anymore, right? So many people move in and they really don't even think about it as being a private road. And so lots of folks will, and I'm sure they come up to members of the planning board, but why is my road, why isn't the town taking care of my road? And, lo and behold, it's because it's a private development. But to them, they've just moved into a street. And so I think there's a public education component as well. And I know we talked about that maybe last year. We talked a little bit about, I think, we had a presentation from DPW and from town engineering about the list and how to get on it. And so I think we just have to continue to promote that.
Madam Chair, if you'd like us to update the board on that in the next couple of months,
Sure,
we can certainly work with Public Works and do that.
Another reason why people get confused about private and public roads is the town plows most of the private roads. The town provides for trash pickup on most of the private roads. And so the distinction as to what's a public road and what's a private road is very hard for a homeowner to know, because the town's doing so much of this work on their roads, that must be a public road.
That's the problem. They don't know until the road falls apart, and then they got to wait another 10 years. So that's why.
And convince everybody in the neighborhood to go along. But Mr. Walker had his hand up for a long time. Did you want to make a quick comment? Yep, just, no, you always gotta come up here. We haven't installed the drop-down microphones like they have in Parliament. I think we need to, in our next go-around, maybe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Grant Walker, Philadelphia Street. I'm a member of town meeting, but otherwise I'm not a member of any town committee. But if the boards would consider it, you might think of the Energy Committee. I hang out with the Energy Committee, and there are a number of people with great expertise. That committee has spent over a year talking, for example, about the various grants and other programs for electric vehicles and so on. So obviously, energy is a big part of transportation. Think of the Energy Committee.
Great point, thank you. Great. Okay, so just moving along from that to, which is something we've already talked about a bit, which is complete streets. And I know that we had in the packet some information from Ray Jack. And I think your question, Charlotte, was a great one, which is something that is sort of a common question, which is, isn't this already adopted? And in fact, the town hasn't officially adopted complete streets. It's in the LCP, but it's something that we haven't done. We haven't adopted it as a town. And so maybe we can have a bit of a discussion, a little bit about why that is and the sort of pros and cons.
Madam Chair, could I ask, Public Works Director Ray Jack was very helpful in assembling this proposed draft, and I know that that has included some input from Tom Planner, Tom Bott. And Ray, would you care to make some comments about the draft for the Planning Board and the Board of Selectmen? I think it might be timely.
Complete Streets was really a state initiative. It has widespread support throughout the transportation community. There are a number of communities identified in the Commonwealth that have already complied to varying degrees with Complete Streets. It's a three-tiered program. The first part of the program is to have a policy in place. That is the Board of Selectmen. And then it has to be acknowledged and forwarded and signed by the chief appointed official of the town, which is the town manager. So those are the two signatures that are required on the policy. There are 10 elements of Complete Streets, and I won't go through them, but it includes vision, implementation. Let's see, there's several others.
We're all in your draft, Ray.
Yeah, they're kind of, a lot of them though are in the form of sentences, okay, that are intended to comply with the 10 different components of a Complete Streets program. But the draft that you have as written meets all of those requirements and would be acceptable by the state as a program. There's a score up to 100, and you have to get 80 out of 100 on the plan in order to be considered acceptable. So once it's accepted by the state, then it makes the town eligible for other programs, namely that they have a technical program which has grants in the form of about $50,000 in order to develop a prioritization plan, which means at that point, that's when we have to evaluate and do an analysis of various transportation components and streets specifically, come up with an actual action plan, which has streets listed in order of priority. So as indicated earlier, it is actually a very complex process because when you're trying to prioritize a street, it does become a question of ADA accessibility, pedestrian capability, safety for pedestrians, bicycles, and every other type of transportation form, meaning rollerblades, skateboards, believe it or not. There's a number of different things. If it has wheels, it's a form of transportation, if you will, that we have to need to think about. The ADA is actually a very large piece of that pie, if you will. So then once the prioritization plan is developed, then third tier would be constructability of various projects. So the town would be required to submit to the state annually a list of about no fewer than 5 different types of projects. And a project could be as simple as installing ADA ramps. It doesn't have to be a massive roadway improvement project. It's a function of where the prioritization plan puts things. But this is a first step toward getting there, and it's the town's commitment, if you will, once adopted, toward that end. The Complete Streets policy is not just about the transportation itself. It does include things like wayfinding. That's a very important component. When we did the Main Street concept plans, that was a corridor study. I know it was mischaracterized as a master plan for the town. It's really not the master plan, but it was a very big area that was done. But it started at Terhune, with the presumption that you don't know where you are, but you came into town. What to do? Where do you want to go? If you're looking to get to Mashpee, we want you to turn at the light and go left, go down and Stop and Shop and turn again. We don't want you coming downtown, but we need to tell them that. They don't know that. So the wayfinding would be a townwide initiative that would start to redirect people to where it was most beneficial from a transportation perspective. If we want them to get to the parking area in downtown, we don't want them going down Main Street. Go down Kathleen Bates. That would be the alternate route to get expeditiously to the traffic parking areas, if you will. So all of those are helpful, but in the end, what it's trying to do is to take a lot of complex issues, pedestrians, roadway widths, markings, signage, you name it, bikeway safety across the board, and try to incorporate it into all of our planning initiatives. And that's really what it boils down to. So it does get into the capital planning component of it. Any capital plan that we put together would necessarily need to evaluate those components as part of that overall plan. So.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to say anything about, I know I've heard you talk about complete streets before, but anything, I think you come from a community that had adopted, had a policy in place or worked with communities?
Actually not a policy in place, but a policy working towards it. In fact, that's when I first met, as it turns out, some of our Falmouth DPW staff at a complete streets training in Plymouth. It took Peter about a year to mention that he was sitting behind me looking over my shoulder taking notes. But I would much rather look over his shoulder and take his notes, frankly. So we've been to the training. Many staff people have been here for training level 1 and level 2. So we've sort of set the table to allow us to sort of move forward with that. So if we've got a concerted effort and an agreed on policy, we can, those are, as Ray pointed out, those are the things you got to start with, is that policy.
Can we refine that a little bit? Because is it a policy we have to originate, or can we just say we want to adopt the complete streets policy as it's written?
Well, the complete streets policy, Ray has put, the draft he's given us is one we
Correct.
could adopt. Probably not this meeting, but we could certainly get this on the website, publicize this is what we're considering, and at our next meeting, vote it.
Is there any reason why we shouldn't do that?
Not to my knowledge.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a minute, because I know what we've heard from some folks who are opponents of the idea of, and I think mostly it's a lack of information about what it means, but folks think because we have a complete street policy that we're locked into sort of a certain rigid design for everything that we do. There has to be, I've heard people say, we're gonna have 10 feet on every street on the side because there'll be, bike lanes and pedestrian lanes. I think there's a misconception about what the policy, if you adopt a policy, what it really binds you to in terms of town for development.
Correct. The nature of complete streets, it's not that rigid to begin with, and it does recognize the Complete Streets program, and as a matter of fact, transportation planning in general, recognizes the fact that each situation is unique. I think the Section 3 in Falmouth, with respect to East Falmouth Highway that we looked at for the Main Street corridor area, was a really, really good example of that, where you do have to be able to have exceptions to the rules. So in a scenario like this, probably one of the bigger components of that policy that you are looking at has an exemption in there whereby if the costs are considered extraordinarily high with respect to the overall project, and by definition that means 20%. So if a project goes up 20% in order to incorporate complete streets, then we don't have to do that. We can refuse to do that, if you will, because that doesn't make good economic sense. It's nice to have complete streets that have everything under the sun all the time, everywhere, but that's a tremendous amount of money. But this puts us in a direction whereby There are exemptions built into it that allow for us to have that flexibility. So what you have as written was a compilation that I had put together that will in fact meet all of the requirements of the Complete Streets program and benefit the town overall. So.
Did you have your hand up, John?
I was just gonna say, just to
And then John.
emphasize that, is, Complete Streets is context sensitive. The one thing we learned in the training, the all-day training that we had, is if you've got a 50-foot right-of-way, you can't put everything into it. You have to decide what are the priorities for this section of street based on what level of service it's functioning, and what are those things that are going about. So you can't get all those things into the road right-of-way, so you look at how much right-of-way you have and what you can do to work within that right-of-way and what are those priorities. And Mass DOT has variously changed their policies from working from the center line out to the edge of the right-of-way in. In other words, here's the center line for trucks, we're gonna use all this up for trucks, and whatever's left over will be that usable shoulder for something else. In the case of Complete Streets, in that context-oriented, like, what have you got, what kind of right-of-way have you got, and what are those needs, and how do we work in figuring out what are those things? And it could be different for, they will obviously be different, as Ray points out, depending on where you're at and what the road's doing.
Thank you. John, and then I'll come back this way.
I have two questions. One, would this apply to private roads? And two, who would be the board that would grant any relief that would be required?
It would be the Board of Selectmen as far as any relief with respect to private roads. The presumption under any Complete Streets programs is that whatever regulations that the town has enforced, that it will review those regulations in order to accommodate complete street objectives on any road. So that would include any of the subdivision roads or private roads.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, Sue and then Sam, or Sam and Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, to you, Ray, to what extent can we actually use the Complete Street model and then phase the construction? So in other words, we use it as a vision of what's going to be there, but because money is always going to be a constraint, we can do a portion of it and then add on to it later. Are we constrained by grant money that might be available?
One thing I would say about the grant money, I don't think it's going to be there very long. Granted, they're talking $50,000 for technical assistance, $400,000 per project. I want to say they allocated maybe $16 million overall to the entirety of the project over all these years. It hasn't been refunded to my knowledge. But nonetheless, eventually they will run out of money. And of course, as with many of the grant programs, they're intended to open the door, but not necessarily hold it open all the time. So I don't, even at this time, I think that there are state officials that we've spoken with that have been very frank in saying don't really expect any money to come back on it. But at the same time, it does put us in a much better position when it comes to things like Chapter 90 funding, and which we get annually to the tune of about $1.2 million, as well as any other state and or federal funds that we receive for any project. It's a requirement along those lines. So it puts us in a much, much better position. The prioritization plan is critical. Like I said, there will be large, medium, and small projects contained in that prioritization plan. Another component that we're about to embark on is an ADA transition plan, which is something that we are required to do. But the bottom line is we are to look at our corridor type of infrastructure, pathways, signalization for ADA compatibility. And that is a plan that we're undertaking at the present time. That too is going to get factored into that prioritization plan. So quite frankly, from a priority perspective, I would think that one of the overriding themes here is going to be the ADA component, which will also help to satisfy the other components, meaning pedestrian safety as well as bicycle safety. So.
Thank you. Sue?
You did kind of touch on my question in the sense of time and money. So the grants, it's an incentive now, but is it really going to come through? Probably not, but it does fit in our other planning. So I was wondering if this would mean we would need additional staffing to go through all of this, these mandates to get where we're going, while we're talking about more firefighters, more fire stations, more roads. I mean, there are a lot of things that we would love to spend money on, so I'm just wondering about the impact in terms of the fiscally and going forward.
For the program initiation as well as overall implementation over time would not require any additional staffing. It is an effort, but even under the technical assistance component, the primary purpose of that is for the purpose of engaging a consultant who's familiar with developing the prioritization plans and working with the town in order to get that done expeditiously. So even at that level, there's some effort on our part, but nothing that's not manageable.
Just paying the consultant.
I'm sorry?
Just paying the consultant would
Right.
be the extra, and not much more time.
Right.
It sounds like the major parts of this you're planning on doing anyway for other reasons, not for complete streets, so we're already putting that effort in.
Right.
And should be, because I mean, this is really, I mean, it's user sort of safety, the usefulness of roads for the largest number of people. So the policy is helpful, even if grant money doesn't flow through endlessly, it's a helpful exercise to engage in, because we really should be looking at, development with an eye towards all of that.
Exactly, and even getting back to the transportation overall that the boards have been discussing tonight, you get into the interconnectivity within the towns and communities, so you have to be able to look at transportation from that perspective. Schools, businesses, commercial activity, all of those come into play as far as trying to develop transportation plans that meet those needs. Planning is actually huge. If you look at the town's main corridor areas, 151, Thomas Landers Road, Sandwich Road, Main Street, 28, and the list goes on, the future of areas within those areas determines what the transportation needs are going to be. What do we need to do to any of those particular roads in order to make it more functional, more safe, what have you? One of the good examples along Main Street are the curb cuts. They're everywhere. So we need to start getting a handle on some of those curb cuts and controlling how people are going in and out of these various businesses, and that of and by itself can go a long way to enhancing safety. But all of those have to be looked at in order to properly look at a road and be able to determine what transportation improvements are necessary in order to meet the transportation needs now and beyond 20 years.
I just wanted to say, I served on the Route 28 advisory thing, and from that, I learned that there's tremendous flexibility in the state's understanding of complete streets. We were measuring individual trees. I mean, which trees do we really wish to find a way to save? Is it possible to do that? A way can be found to do that. Do you always have to have just this wide all the time? No, you don't. You can take other things into consideration. And by the time the planning was complete, all the people who abutted that route seemed to be satisfied that they were not going to be harmed by it and that it would be an improvement. And the other point I want to make is that what it really does is it means that each time the town undertakes a transportation project, they're going to do something to a major road, all the bike people don't have to arm up, get out, protest, bring themselves to your attention because it's built in. And the ADA people don't have to because it's built in. So that you're going to have to take their concerns into consideration. You've already promised to do it by adopting complete streets, and you want to do it anyway. It's not something you don't want to do.
Yep, Doug?
Corinne, could you please remind us how the Chapter 91 works? Did you say there's a $1.2 million cap on reimbursement?
That's what we received, and probably one of the biggest components of that equation for determining what, it's different for each community, but one of the bigger components of that is the actual road miles that we have to maintain is one of the bigger elements of that. Unfortunately,
The more private roads we take, the more money we get.
it won't be proportionally correct, however, that I can assure you. Unfortunately, it doesn't even come close to meeting the needs of any community. $1.2 million, we can blow through that rather quickly. Not that long ago, let's say 15, 18 years ago, asphalt in place was in the $30, $33 a ton range. Today, it's pushing 100. So how much has complete streets gone up in that same time frame? Went from 800,000 to 1.2. So we experienced a 300% increase, and we got the equivalent of about maybe, 100% increase on the Chapter 90 funding, we'd be looking at over $3 million a year as a typical appropriation to be able to start to move on what we need to do.
And where are we at now?
1.2.
We just stay within that because it's practical.
Well, that's what we've been working with, and we do have some supplemental funds that are appropriated through our capital plan with respect to highways. So that allows us to do sidewalks and things of that nature, but, yeah.
Thanks.
Madam Chair, if you would so permit, there was a comment earlier, and I believe it was Charlotte brought it up, about outside state and federal funding. And while Ray is at the microphone, he has been a key point person for us in, for instance, on the Route 28 project, as the board is aware, working to, through all the multiple steps, he and his colleagues in Public Works to position us so that we can be in a reasonable position to try and capture some of that state and federal funding. I wonder if it might be helpful just for Ray to give just a thumbnail snapshot on that, because sometimes it's not obvious where the town is positioned and postured, and Ray can update us.
Sure.
Okay. And it's really good. As Ms. Harris had indicated, that program's actually the TIP program, Transportation Improvement Program, run through the county. There are 13 MPOs, or metropolitan organizations as they're known as, throughout the Commonwealth. Cape Cod is one MPO of them by itself. So federal money that comes into the state for transportation gets channeled out, and that's one of the venues that it gets channeled out to the various MPOs. So that incorporates a lot of things. They get into the trains and the buses and everything. They get a significant amount of money for that. But at the local level, we're not really into the trains, but it funnels down here for local transportation projects. And I think they get funded to the tune of about $9 million a year at this point. But that's for all of Cape Cod. And there's some large-scale projects out there, and I think Main Street on our side is a good example of what they can cost. That carried a price tag of over $10 million. So there is all of that money and then another $1 million from another year, all right, just to fund a Falmouth project in one particular year. And there are several others on there that are in $5 to $8 million range. So they've gotten, the projects have gotten larger, and the ability of that program to be able to manage it has really gotten stretched. So you go on to it, it's a 5-year program, so you'll start out usually in year 5, the end or last year of that program, and then try to advance your project up the ladder. Now, it could theoretically take you 5 years, but my hope was that, and knowing how the TIP program works, various projects are in various phases. Some are in design, some are in conceptual, some are at 75%, some are at 100%. The ones that are at 100% on any given year are the ones that generally move forward. Some are slower than others. So you can advance the projects up through that program. But that is the regional program for the Cape, and we've actually done a lot of projects in the past under that program, as have a number of other communities on the Cape. So it's a huge benefit, and it's an adjunct to that, but it's highly competitive as well. So, but fortunately with the Main Street corridor area projects, we were able to get that entered into the program, met all the requirements. It got scored. It scored very well. So this coming year, it will actually get into that 5-year component. The only reason they didn't do it this year is one of the communities needed extra money for one of the projects that was already gone. So they just held the line on where that program was for this year. But next year it would definitely be going in.
But I think in connection with that, the more that you're doing things like Complete Streets and just sort of the Transportation Management Committee, you know, regularly sort of in a just both at the granular and the large scale level thinking about these issues, it makes some of those projects run more smoothly because we don't have, you know, hopefully, I mean, the Citizen Advisory Group was phenomenal, but that was a bumpy process, right? We were sort of going along in the development and suddenly we had to constitute this. We charged them with a very short period of time to turn around, get us information. Ideally, you know, maybe that's not how every project goes. Ideally, you already have had those conversations. And a committee like the Transportation Management Committee is in the community and they're doing some of those forums. So they're giving feedback. You know, I think all of that, the stuff that we're talking about tonight aids in getting those projects, you know, aids in what you're doing to get those projects that much closer to being ready for the tip and being able to say, yes, we've considered this. Yes, we've, done the outreach, and there's not a lot of pushback from the community. So I think these all are, have a monetary, hopefully a monetary value as well for us.
And just to add to that, because I don't know if you emphasized it enough, is that there's a ton of jealousy all over the Cape. As I work regionally, Falmouth gets it because they're shovel-ready.
Don't cry about it.
I'm
She gets
sorry.
very emotional
I
about
get so
transportation.
emotional about transportation. But it's Falmouth led by you, it's our expertise in getting in that right position, and you explained it, but you really didn't tout just how crucial that is, and that's how you move ahead of other projects. And, Falmouth has really been, getting the benefit of more than its share, and thank you for that expertise.
Well, thank you.
A question about the Main Street, which project were you saying is getting in the queue? Is the Main Street project ahead of the East Falmouth 28 project, or the same timeline?
No, the project was submitted as a whole.
Okay.
So it did include Phase 3. With when we submitted, it was going to be with the understanding that Phase 3 was going to undergo revision during the conceptual process.
If I could, I got a question about the curb cuts. So, do you get most of the ideas of how to make the improvements from that transportation master plan, or is that part of it, or most of it?
No, if you can believe this, from a transportation master plan perspective, I think that was one of the failings of the study, was that it did not look at the curb cuts.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Interesting.
And we do need to look at the curb cuts as we design Main Street now.
And how much authority is there to change those curb cuts? Do you have to kind of give them a carrot or beat them with a stick? How do you get them to get rid of all those?
Well, quite frankly, I think the carrot is that I could stand up here and say that we're going to do all kinds of wild and wonderful things. And if I attach a price tag to it, okay, well, we better slow down. If I said it was free, everybody be on board. Well, that would be free. The goal there is, if we're going to be changing the front of any of the landscape along this corridor area to benefit the town, we're incorporating that cost as part of our project plan. Therefore, when we come to talk to you, business owner, about the possibility of changing your curb cut out there, we'll say, this is what we'd like to do. This is going to benefit us, it's going to benefit you, and you don't have to worry about paying for it because it will be included in the project cost.
And that fixes most of the problems right there, right?
It does. It does.
We had a Route 28 in East Falmouth. The intersection was reworked, and there's a curb cut on the corner that is right into the intersection coming out of the bank there. I thought for sure that would go away, but it's still there. And they've got 3 curb cuts on a corner there, and the one that's right involved with the intersection is just, it seems like a problem, and that was not able to be fixed for some reason.
Are you talking about Davisville?
Yes.
Yeah. Those don't go through us. That was a state project intersection, and they did that one pretty much on their own. But those curb cuts there, especially with that bank, I believe, would have had to have gone through zoning if there was any changes on that. But I would defer to Tom on that.
I was just going to say, we, planning board, through redevelopment, we look at those issues. We've eliminated a curb cut at 587 Main, at 797 Main. We've got something coming up starting tomorrow night on Cumberland Farms in East Falmouth. There'll be another there eliminated. So we're looking at opportunities and taking an incremental approach and getting rid of them when they are. I can tell you, I've talked with prospective developers and told them, I'd love to get rid of one of these curb cuts, and the developer said, well, I hear you, but I'm not quite sure I'm ready to give up one of those. So we're constantly looking at where those opportunities are, because every curb cut you got is another opportunity for traffic to get backed up with turning motions that you don't need.
And adopting these new policies, does it improve our ability to negotiate? Is there any advantage there?
For the most part, when we look at these projects, for the folks who do this as their day job, it's pretty obvious that curb cut has to go. So for the most part, through best management practices and design, we're looking at them, not in the absence of a policy, not that we need a policy for that. What makes good design makes good design. And so we're looking at getting rid of those as often as we can.
Anything, thank you so much, Ray, that was really helpful, and thank you for the draft, and I think, we'll certainly, I know this board will want to take a look at it further, I'm sure planning will want to as well, and then, we can just get some public feedback and go from there, so that's really helpful, thank you. Anything further on Complete Streets?
I think we're complete.
Anything else we almost touched on?
Yeah, I think we've already sort of talked about the truck deliveries and the issues with that on Main Street, as well as sort of the parking lots and shuttles. And then we talked about the committee. Is there anything, yep.
I'd like
Go
to
ahead,
make
Paul.
one, I'd just like to make one point. As you are aware, the Shivers Pond Trail project is moving slowly. It's going before the Community Preservation Committee this week, and hopefully town meeting will approve it. That will provide a very safe, environmental friendly, ADA compliant access from Lawrence School to downtown, which would help the parking situation.
So Megan, on the parking lots, we probably should talk about the two town meeting articles that we have coming up in November that relate to those.
Did you want
Happy to do that, Madam Chair, if it's timely. I don't know, Doug, did you have?
I'm just gonna, I know John, sorry, Bob had his hand up, and then so did Doug. So do you want to just start, Bob?
Yeah, I really want to reiterate the need for the a shuttle system and utilizing the school parking lots. The issue came to forefront this summer with the queues at the beaches, and people sitting there with their engines running. It's not good for the air quality of the area. And it's been done in numerous places. We have an annual event that we take our grandkids out to P-Town every summer. We climb the Pilgrim Tower with them. We park out at the beach, take the shuttle in. They love taking the shuttle in. It's nice. We don't have to worry about trying to park in a crowded town like P-Town. And it's about time Falmouth did that and took it seriously. And we've got, I drive past the high school in the summer. We got about 17 buses sitting out there doing nothing. We should be utilizing them. It would give some of the bus drivers a summer job as well. It just makes sense. And I really want this committee, when it's
To look
formed,
at that.
to really push that.
And look at issues like cost and sort of
Yes.
what, just in terms of actual capital for equipment, things like that, and then
Right.
staffing, what would that look like? And they can look at models of,
Staffing and what it would cost, what you should charge people and all that. We need to get people away from the beaches and shuttle them around.
it just makes for a better user experience as well when I don't think there's anything more frustrating than sitting with your kids in a car on a hot day at Old Silver Beach, that's pretty rough. Doug,
Just
and
as-
then Sam,
Yeah, I just want to mention relative to that, there's actually CCRTA that provides that shuttle service in Providence, and they've been doing that for 20 years.
Yeah.
This is not a new model.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask also, how did you envision it? And then you mentioned the school buses, so kind of a makeshift volunteer sort of program. I was gonna wonder if we should be asking the CCRTA to provide an additional trolley, and maybe we would kick in some funding if we wanted extra service. I don't know how that would play out.
Yeah,
I think those are all possible
those
things
are
to
all
look into.
questions that
All right.
committee-
We have some comments on that.
Okay.
When we have a moment.
Want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. I
That's
apologize.
okay. I got a different thing I wanted to mention before we
But
go off.
it's on point for what you've raised, and Tom has a couple of slides. We can fire those up, Tom. I know the board is aware, as Doug Jones has indicated, we have two warrant articles that the board has approved to bring to town meeting that, if we get a green light, would allow us to move forward to negotiate with the potential acquisition of two possible municipal parking sites. One is a site just under 1 acre at Spring Bars Road and Worcester Court, and the second one is behind the Bank of America building near the town common, and that's the first one that Tom has displayed here. And as I think the board's familiar with it, it's extremely underutilized. It's also not fully developed for parking as it could be. It is still privately owned by the Bank of America, and that entire complex is, of course, for sale. We have approached the Bank of America on more than one occasion, inquiring in the past about lease or purchase, and they've indicated that they want to keep everything together. So that's why we're seeking, with the board's concurrence, town meeting approval to go ahead and negotiate, again, either a lease or a purchase. The second is just under 1 acre, again, at Spring Bars and Worcester Court. It would Much of it is already in pavement. It would need to be improved, of course, but it is in an excellent position for a potential municipal parking lot that would be within walking distance or a very short shuttle distance of many of the attractions downtown, as well as the beaches. And so I'm hopeful that with the assistance of and support, which we already have, of the Board of Selectmen and perhaps of the Planning Board as well, with your comments tonight, thank you. Tom and I have assembled these graphics, and if we get a green light, we'd like to see what we can pull together and bring back to future town meeting, again, to either lease or purchase these sites. Have also reached out to Tom Caher from the Cape Cod RTA. I did so this past summer, and actually we'll be meeting Wednesday of this week to discuss their shuttle bus service and the potential for adding these two sites that we just noted to be part of that service, as well as potential suggestions for improvements to the existing service. And I appreciate Selectman Sam Patterson assisting me in that regard. He has been heavily involved, I think, as the other members of the board are aware, with CCRTA in the past. And so Sam will be joining me in this meeting with Tom and his staff. So we hope to be prepared to hit the ground running if we're fortunate enough to be able to move forward with one or both of these locations that could shuttle persons not only downtown into Woods Hole, but also conceivably to our beaches in the summertime, which is the reason that we're trying to look at a parcel a little larger like the 1 acre piece. You really need to have significant density of parking to make many of these things work. So we're guardedly optimistic that we'll have the kind of support to begin moving in this direction. You know, that having been said, I know that there's some discussion and suggestions that have been around for a long time about structured multi-tier parking. This is attempting to take advantage of the cards we're dealt, which is surface parking, and these are parcels that are already paved and used for either parking or storage. So let's utilize them to benefit the public, and I think that's the direction we would like to go if everyone is in concurrence.
On the Article 11 question dealing with the Bank of America parcel, is the article written right now just on that parcel that includes the parking, or could it be expanded to be the entire? I know they don't want to separate it. Is there any reason that we shouldn't consider purchasing the entire piece of property for a lot more parking and potentially the building? I know right now we still don't have the town council in building owned by the town. Is there some reason that bank could become useful for the town to own?
Well, I think the short answer is, I believe with an amendment on the floor of town meeting, it could be expanded to include more than what is just identified here in that graphic. As to the building itself, you know, that would be another matter. But again, it would be up to the board and town meeting if you'd like to expand that to the purchase of buildings as well as real estate.
I know we don't really like doing that, but it is a good building, and maybe that has tons of parking attached to it.
Jim, and then Bob, and then.
I'm familiar with both these things. I think as far as the bank goes, I think you would have to take the whole thing, because you'll just take away, you lose a lawsuit on the value of the bank taking away their parking. They definitely need, this is not on the sewer. So in any redevelopment of that parcel at all, any expansion at all, you need that backland just for a septic system to make it work, because there's no sewer in that area unless you're gonna change that and expand it. And the other one I'm concerned about is on Worcester Court. That's smack dab in the middle of Davis Straits, and we kind of have a whole program of form-based code, and what you don't do in form-based code is build parking lots on the street. Okay, it's just, you gotta really understand a little bit more about it before you take that step. That's more of a less of looking at the older way of doing it. I really think that that's an integral piece of Davis Straits, with the long-term vision of down to the water and walkways and pedestrian ways, and having a street face with just nothing but parking doesn't fly as far as designing for people. It's going back and designing for cars. And I'm really a little bit worried that this discussion is parking cars. If we get into the Davis Straits, we're gonna be talking about people, walkways, pathways, and not just more park. There's nothing more empty than a parking building on a street, or even just the parking itself. There's no warmth to go there, no one wants to be there, it's not comfortable, it doesn't attract people. It fills the need to keep paying in more and more parking, but that's a problem, just creating more and more parking. So you have to take that into consideration, and I think we should at least listen to the architects that we're gonna hire for this job and get a little bit further down before we start paving or parking away on, inside the Davis Straits area. That one piece is critical to it.
Well, just to underscore, we wouldn't be paving something that isn't already paved. But what I guess I want to comment on is, I'm talking about something that can happen within a year. This reset in Davis Straits and redevelopment is not a year out. That's 3 to 5, maybe 10 years, putting a lot of things in motion. We're just talking about a lease potentially. So we're not talking about necessarily taking a parcel of land out of play forever. We're talking about utilizing something that happens to be there and is very close to being in a position where it could serve the town's at least short-term needs.
Solution for next summer.
Exactly, that's what we're trying to advocate, rather than say, let's put it off and put it off and put it off.
Bob?
I agree with both Julian and Jim, and I'm kind of glad this came up, but I like the idea of leasing it, because then we're not locked into something. And what Jim says is true about the whole redevelopment thing, and what Julian says, this is a temporary fix. And I would be amenable to a temporary fix, like a lease of that piece of property.
We look at things. Doug and then Pam.
I see we were gonna get off the truck deliveries on Main Street. Do we wanna leave that for the Transportation Committee when they're formed, or do we wanna consider maybe just sending a letter to the Chamber of Commerce and say, please alert your businesses that we've noticed this is becoming a problem, and try to...
I think we have to ask the Main Street businesses, because they are balancing their deliveries, their customers, their parking, and their workforce. And to try to limit their suppliers on top of all that, we need to know that impact. So
I'm not saying make a law, I'm just saying maybe send a letter and saying, we're noticing it's impacting traffic, and if there's anything can be done, let's try to work together. And
I'd just like that input before we take a position.
I think if we have this committee constituted fairly quickly, they have the winter months that's one of the things that they can, work on, is just to really get that information. Because I think I don't know, I worked for years in Woods Hole, and there literally were delivery companies that said, if you don't want the delivery at 9 o'clock, you're gonna go with another vendor, because we're not coming down there. It's already hard to get, this is like sort of terminal destination, right? Like you get down here and it's not, that productive of a loop. And so, that was always a tough thing, people unloading in the middle of Water Street, but that was like, there wasn't anywhere else where they were gonna go,
I don't
so.
know if it's gonna be an easy solution, but I think it's maybe, as Bob was saying, low-hanging fruit, that
Right.
an assignment we can give them, they can come back with a recommendation, we can act upon that recommendation, and they can actually say, oh, they're listening to us.
Right, something's
They did
happening.
what they advised us to do, and then feel good about their committee and work forward on some of the bigger things that come out after that.
And something you have to take into consideration is, if they have a common carrier plate, they're allowed to do that.
Right.
You just can't take that
Exactly.
away
So I
from
mean,
them.
if you're telling a business and you're telling a delivery,
Yeah.
this can't, it can, and they're just gonna tell you that, that's sorry, but this is what we're doing, and you're just gonna drive around them. I mean, that's the reality of it, but.
And we're not their only customer.
Right.
They can be able to run a profitable business.
So I think there are two separate issues with a shuttle. When I think of all the cars that someone has to get in their car and then drive to another place, as opposed to, has anyone been to Ogunquit, Maine during the summer? No?
Not in about
We're
40
tied
years.
here.
I'm sorry?
We're all tied here.
They have trolleys, Molly, Dolly, whatever, and their little brother Wally. And it goes up and down the main corridors of Route 1A, and picks up passengers and takes them to the beach. And then they circle through, get back, and you go back to your hotel. I think we could do that relatively quickly, as opposed to people getting in their cars, finding where to park, leaving their cars, and then coming back at various stages and putting more traffic back on the main streets during the summer. I mean, I think part of this defeats the purpose of having a shuttle to get people to either the beaches or downtown Falmouth. So it's just a thought, that maybe we could do two things. And Julian, if you've been to Ogunquit, are you familiar with those trolleys?
Yeah, I see it as a different paradigm than the one I'm talking about here, but I follow you. Those are people that are coming in and staying in Ogunquit and being able to traverse. These are folks that are coming in frequently for Chamber of Commerce related activities and other events we have throughout the summer, and driving in from frequently off Cape and staying for the day.
So those are two separate things. I'm looking at people who come here and spend 2 or 3 weeks, and
Right.
they can't get on the parking lots for the beaches, so they wander around. And if you had a designated group of trolleys or whatever to just pick people up and take them to the beach, that's separate. And thanks for clarifying that for me. Those are more
what you mean.
in-town activities, and this is more people that just come here for vacation and don't want to have to get themselves to the beach because they can't walk to the beach.
And just a quick point about the articles, it bothers me that we don't have a plan, and then whether it's shuttle or, you know, I know that Sam's been working with CCRTA and has Julian, but it's not like we have a plan and the plan says we need to buy or lease land. We're just suddenly gonna buy or lease land, but we have no plan in the way, so it's a little backwards to me. And Pam's suggestion not only saves whatever, a couple million that it might take to negotiate these deals and to avoid litigation, but it also, it allows a Main Street building to continue as a Main Street developed business with parking. So I struggle with that.
I want to suggest, because it's probably, we're spinning a little bit now, that the reason for this to be on the agenda now, the prime reason is, this is the time to try to solve some of the problems for next summer.
Even
This
if they're
is really
temporary.
The
Yep.
time, yeah.
Mhm.
So we can, by reinstituting the committee, giving them the charge, and hopefully they will come up with some successful solution for this coming summer.
Right, and I have to say, I think, you know, looking at it in stages, I mean, all development takes place in stages. This is problem-solving that's gonna be in stages, so, you know, it may be leasing a particular piece of property as we're looking at other things, but, you know, if the goal is to sort of address some of those problems next summer, and we're trying to think about ways to kind of implement some possible solutions, I think, you know, you're right, that it's timely, and there's time for a committee that can get together and work on that, so. Okay, anything else yep, Paul?
I'd be concerned too about the Spring Bars Road parcel. While it's a short-term solution, there's water and sewer and access to transportation there, and a higher use might be housing.
Anything else on the issue of truck deliveries or parking shuttles? No? Okay, do you folks feel like it's a good time to move to housing?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
does anyone need a break? Everyone good? Okay. Okay, so, do we want to do the presentation? The PowerPoint? Does that work? And then we can kind of use that to kick off the conversation?
Listen,
Do you want to, do you want to just sort of set
I
up?
know nothing really about 40R, and when I ran into Peter, he said, you guys don't really know anything about 40R, and this is an alternative means of providing housing. And so, becoming educated together, and we are all listening at the same time.
Hearing the same stuff, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I thought it was
Great.
absolutely great that we do this as an educational forum then, and then we can spin off and discuss a little bit.
Thank you.
So before I say a word about 40R, let me talk about Davis Straits and form-based code. So the Cape Cod Commission did the Davis Straits Reset Plan in one of those options, one of those recommendations in the Davis Straits was for the town to consider form-based code. And so 40R is a complement and to form-based code. We're not talking about one or the other. We're talking about them in unison. So under form-based code, the uses aren't so critical. It's how the form meets function, how the town is going to look, because the thing that the development community is looking for is a lack of uncertainty. if you want to build in this area, this is what it's going to look like, this is how it's going to lay out, so you know. And so the form-based code essentially is that picture that tells 1,000 words. So currently, we are moving forward with form-based code. We have an article in a funding request in Article 3 for $49,900 to enlist a consultant to help us develop form-based code. So we'll be talking about that at town meeting.
But we have not adopted form-based coding yet in this town, have we?
We have not, and that is the necessity of the consultant, because I can write zoning, and I've written a lot of zoning. In fact, I've written a lot of zoning, but form-based code is pictures and graphics.
I understand.
I cannot draw blood. So we need people with skills not only to make these graphics, but also to work in the community in what those things are. And we already had a start on this with our Community Resilience by Design project. We did a visual preference survey to know what sort of forms, what sort of building types people are comfortable with. And so each one of these steps is building on that. So form-based code is zoning. So we would hire this consultant in November, well, assuming we get an affirmative vote at town meeting. So we would look to bring that person on to help develop the form-based code to bring back to town meeting to pass as zoning.
So if it passes, then that means we are adopting form-based coding, but that is not something that has been decided yet that we're heading in this direction for sure.
And November town meeting is to hire a hired gun to write the code that we'll bring back to town meeting to approve.
So if it doesn't get approved, this is off the table, the 40 Rs?
Well, it certainly was going to complicate it, and I'll get into that.
This is I mean, if we don't even know if we're adopting form-based coding, I guess I'm wondering, is this premature to be?
No, there is.
Can 40 Rs happen without form-based coding?
It can.
Okay, great.
And form-based code can happen without 40 Rs.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just wanted to find out.
Right. So, as I said, we'd hoped to have a representative from the Department of Housing and Community Development here, so we borrowed their slides. We chatted them up quite a bit to make sure we weren't out of the loop on what we were doing. In addition, previously in the town of Kingston, we developed a 40R district. It's one of the slides that's in here. I didn't put it in there. It was already in there. So when we get to that, I'll pause for a moment to talk about how that worked in Kingston as opposed to how it might relate to Falmouth as well. But 40R is a housing bylaw. It is essentially about creating affordable housing. It is the carrot of affordable housing that 40B is to the stick. So in 40B, people show up in your community and say, we're going to put this type of housing on this piece of property, and we don't have to listen to your local rules. 40R is voluntary. It allows the town to decide where they want to do affordable housing and how they want it to look and how they want it to play out. So it has an affordable component to it as well as the market rates. And there are various densities, and densities we've talked about here recently in the Affordable Housing Forum and other forums about getting density to a place that will actually provide some opportunities for a diversity of housing mixes as well as affordable units as well. So the density under form-based code is for single-family residents, it's 8 dwelling units per acre. That is what you typically see. This is what the Department of Housing and Community, this is what the folks at the Housing Appeals Committee believe is a reasonable number for a 40B, 8 units per acre. But it has really no design component to it. So in this case, it would have this design component to it. 2 to 12 units per acre for 2 and 3 family. You usually don't see a whole lot of that in 40Rs. And up to 20 dwelling units per acre for multifamily. There's a 20% requirement for affordability. We'll talk about 25% for apartments in just a moment as well. And there's funding available from the Commonwealth. So if you adopt the zoning, the Commonwealth will cut a check for somewhere between $10,000 and $600,000, depending on how many units that you have zoned for the district. And this is where we get into how does that person who's helping us design these things through form-based code and in this area determine what the unit types are going to be and how that's going to lay out. In addition, for every unit that you build, market rate or affordable, the state provides another incentive payment of $3,000 per unit. That money goes directly to the town of Falmouth. There are no strings attached to it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, you keep mentioning form-based coding as a part of this thing, and I don't understand why it is necessarily tied to form-based coding as opposed to smart growth zoning.
Well, if we say we'd like you to build 20 units per acre What is that going to look like?
I understand you can determine that but we could determine that with our zoning already in some other way. We don't have to use form-based zone to do so, do we?
It is highly recommended you have design standards, you have something that people are going to build to.
But the 40R is not limited only by doing it that way. I guess you keep using the language saying that the 40R has to be done with form-based coding, and we have not adopted that, and so I'm worried about that connection.
There's also another side. The form-based code hasn't adopted 40R. This is a whole different function. This is Tom's idea of getting government funding in on doing it. It's not even been discussed by the planning board. It's a new idea. We're all trying to learn it together and not say that you have to do both together or it's all one and the same. We're getting confused here.
I'm getting extremely confused.
You are, and you're right.
Because he keeps mentioning the form coding as a part of the 40R, and I don't know why that is.
So my point is that we are moving forward with form-based code. The planning board has made a decision to move forward with form-based code. We have an article on town meeting floor to fund form-based code.
And so we can't do the 40Rs if that fails. And I guess I'd like you to present it, the 40Rs, as it could happen either way.
We're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
Correct.
But the way you keep presenting it, I get confused, and I'm led to believe if we don't do the form-based code, we can't do this either. And
That is incorrect.
Okay, thank you.
But they go well together, so you're looking at it as ideally a package.
They're complementary.
Right.
So if we're looking at form-based code, here's how we can do form-based code and add an affordable component to it, and add some funding to help supplement the cost that we're going to have. So form-based code, a picture tells 1,000 stories.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if I could maybe bring in another sort of basic element to this that may help with some of these questions. I think, and I may be totally wrong, that in both cases, form-based code and 40R, these aren't things that you adopt for the whole town all at once. You pick a certain discrete parcels, a discrete area, a number of parcels, and you say, okay, we're going to apply either 40R or form-based code or both to that specific place.
Thank you.
To the Davis Straits reset area, and that's specifically what we're talking about for both form-based code
part of your question.
and for 40R. We're looking at this in the Davis Straits area that's been previously identified. So under 40R, there are numerous designations. There are transitory development locations. That's the typical thing you see by the train station. There are areas of concentrated development, which is what we'd be looking at for downtown areas and redevelopment areas, and other highly suitable locations. Things like Northampton, which you'll see later on, has done one of these for an abandoned state hospital. So those are the areas of highly suitable locations. We'd be looking at an area of concentrated development, which is essentially the Davis Straits. And so here you see we've got our aerial map, and these are the bounds of the Davis Strait reset area as it goes through and around as conceived by the Davis Straits reset plan. So as I said, 40R is an affordable housing zoning bylaw. So the thing that it brings to the table that form-based code may not is that affordable component as well. So the 40R characteristics, you typically have an as-of-right development. So this would go to the planning board for site plan review, and would go to the planning board for site plan review based upon the fact that they're building it as we've identified it, through design standards that are developed through form-based code, and allow people to build the densities they're looking at in the areas we've identified, in the housing types we've identified through form-based code. Here you can see some of the things we'll see coming out of the form-based code, how walls, how private development sets up in the public realm along the streets and things like that. As I said, 20% of the units are required to be affordable in a 40R development, up to 80% of the area median income. At least 20% of the entire district has to be affordable. So I'm just going to make up a number here, and let's say the number's 500 units over these 76 acres in the Davis Straits. So out of that, we would net those 20%, those 100 affordable units out of this development. And that is a big push in moving along our needs identified in the housing production plan for creating some affordable units. If you look at apartments, in apartments, if you have if you do an apartment complex, and there's 200 units in the apartment complex, 25%, 20% affordable, gives you 40 apartments that are affordable. If you have 25% of these affordable, the state gives you credit for all 100 units. So you created 100 apartments, only 25% are affordable, but you get credit on your subsidized housing inventory for all 100 of those. So we would typically have a cap of 20% of affordable in the event of rental development, it would be 25% to make sure that we are allowed to count all those units on our subsidizing housing inventory. As we talked about before, as we know from 40B, there are income limitations on those type of units. So these are the price points for the dollars and cents that a household would have to make to qualify for that, and this is the base rent for under 40B or under 40R for those particular developments.
Could I get a clarification? I thought the R stand for rental. Are these all rentals all the time?
No, it's just a part of the statute.
Yeah, 40R, we use a lot of letters in Massachusetts general law. We went from 40B, and it took them all those other letters to get to a better idea, 40R. And 40S is the component that allows funding for your schools if there's a shortfall in school. Okay. So it's just the number that the legislature put on it.
Okay, thank you.
So as I said before, this is the incentive payments that the Commonwealth provides under 40R. So if you're looking at 201 to 500 units, there could be an incentive payment from the Commonwealth of $350,000 for adopting the zoning, and another $3,000 for each unit that's produced. And that's money with no strings attached that the town can do as they see fit with. How that process works, we would initially, and we've already actually been talking with DHCD, but we would look together at what our plan might be and what we were considering, and go chat with the folks at DHCD about how that might play out. After that, we would come back and have a larger hearing about adopting that, because both the Planning Board and the Board of Selectmen have to sign off on 40R. Because as we talked about before, there's a transportation and infrastructure component, and as the Selectmen, as the road commissioners, they're part of that process to say, yes, we think this is a good idea to move that forward.
Tom, could you just go back for a minute? With the incentive payments, are you saying that this is in the context of a town-developed project, or just, so a private developer comes in, this development takes place, and the town reaps that benefit of that incentive? So even if we don't put $1 into it, but we approve it, and obviously with our zoning, or, passing these laws, we've promoted it, that's money that comes to the town?
That's correct.
Okay,
Doesn't go to the
so it doesn't
developer.
have to be a town?
No.
Okay, great.
In
Thank
fact, these because we know that and no offense to my colleagues here at the town, we know that there are other people who build things better than the town does.
Yes, we don't want to be a landlord.
So if we set the table for the development community to do those sort of developments in the way that we want to see them, in the area we want to see them, and in the direction and in the shape and the form that we want to see them, then we reap the benefit of both having quality development in a place where we know it's going to happen at, in a place that provides affordable units, and there's an incentive payment to the town, as I said.
Which realistically, the town may have some cost associated with an incentive. They may do things to incentivize this development if we're talking about a very large project, like
Correct.
the
And
reset of, Davis Straits.
Correct. In addition to that, there's district increment financing where you capture the increased value of that new property, and we've looked at that. We've been to some of these sessions with the state about looking at creating a district increment finance area where essentially you capture that difference in the value of those properties on the new development. And that money can be used to offset some of those infrastructure costs and things like that as well.
Well, basically, that incentive is just for getting the zoning in place, not doing the project, right?
All you have to do is convince 2/3 of town meeting, it's fine.
Just the zoning and.
And that's not so any
Development
simple
is
task.
not-
It's
I know.
2/3, but
I'm just saying, that's the extent of it.
that is our motivation, that's our incentive to say, we want you to slog through this, we want you to work through this, and at the end of the day, the first thing we're gonna do is get you an incentive payment.
The development has to occur.
The development has to occur within 3 years, or they're gonna ask for their incentive payment back.
Great, yep, Jim?
Yeah. So Tom, you're saying we get if we build 500 units, we get $600,000.
That's correct.
That's costing one average house in Falmouth about $550,000. I think, that's not focusing on the right number to look at that that kind of payment. It's not even close.
I'm just curious of how.
I just wanted to point out, you know, it's not a lot of money.
Right.
And it has really big ramifications, so.
And I think that's a good point, and I would just sort of add another context data point, which is to say that we typically are subsidizing 50 to 65,000 per unit. So this is very small money. Right.
That's through the CPA fund.
Right.
You're saying that 50.
Right, I'm just saying, you know, relative value, just sort of, it's just a general sort of context point, the relative value of these incomes relative to the importance and the cost of the housing. This is, you know, a peripheral, tiny little issue.
Yeah. Well, I myself have never done anything specifically for the money. I've done things because they are what makes sense. They add value, they add quality. The money is okay to have as well. But I would not say, well, let's do this for the money, because if we do things for the money, we're simply chasing money for marginal projects, and that's not the case that we're looking at here. So we get back to, we have this pre-application meeting. We send our application to DHCD about what we want to put together. We adopt the local zoning. We show DHCD that we have the zoning adoption. We get their letter of approval, and we're subject to our first incentive payment.
And actually, I guess going back to those units are only for additionally above what was there before.
For net new units, correct.
Net new units.
So we're looking at the Davis Straits. We've got an awful lot of commercial development and things like that. We're essentially looking at replacing, I charitably refer to them as the dinosaurs of retail. And frankly, when you look at the dollar values of housing versus the big box, there's a lot more value in that housing than there is in the big box for those property owners.
But what isn't part of it that you want communities walkable? You want jobs and homes near each other. Otherwise, you're just putting 1,200 more cars between here and people who have to get to work in Hyannis. I mean, it seems like you want to look at having neighborhoods and that be part of the Davisville redevelopment so people can live near where they work.
And that's the whole concept of a mixed-use development at the Davis Straits, where there are storefronts along the road. You don't necessarily want to have a house right on the main road, but if you've got storefronts and offices and things like that with loft space over tops, and build apartment buildings and higher density housing beyond that. So you try to maintain the character of Falmouth. So as you drive down 28, it looks like Falmouth. It looks like these are one-story buildings, two-story buildings in the front, and as you scale back from the street, you get into larger buildings with parking tucked behind it and things like that, and parking under it. So it's all in the design, which is why the design standards in form-based code is so important, really, to making a successful project for 40R. Because if you just hang out a shingle that says, bring us your 20-acre, we're going to get a lot of ugly boxes.
I mean, we have great examples of some of that. You know, I mean, we always talk about 704, but 704 Main Street is a great example of that. The parking's tucked behind. You have, you know, retail underneath, and you know, great living space above. And I'm forgetting the address, but the other project that Linda Clark put together. No, across from the tire. Yeah, across from.
Schoolhouse.
That's another great example where, you know, a great utilization of that. You don't look at it and see the parking. You see this, you know, the space. There's a little bit of retail in that front part, but I think, you know, we have some examples that we can sort of point to. It's not something completely new. It just is as a concept for something that the town would take on.
And I talked briefly with Linda while she was in today. I didn't mention this specifically, but at no point has she told me to stay off her turf and not try to develop more housing.
Megan?
Yes, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Something else with form-based code is you're not limited to what the zoning allows in that space now.
Right.
You could have higher-end businesses in there, some engineering firms that might do light-based manufacturing with the solid printers that they make, manufacturing prototypes or something like that. So you also have to look at that end. So it isn't necessarily just low-wage jobs with restaurants and retail. That there could be some higher-wage jobs that go into a mixed-use development that is form-based code.
Charlotte?
I think we have to be careful not to mix up 40R and form-based code. 40R is a state program, comes with a lot of regulations that are complicated, that really need to be thought through, and we're just sort of looking at it. Other communities have tried it, they've found a benefit, maybe we would. It's just something we're looking at, and it's new. Form-based code is something that the planning board has been talking about now for a long time. We're very committed to it. We hope that you are going to be equally committed to it, and that we will get our consultant, and it will start to move forward. Of course, we haven't adopted it, we can't adopt it till we have the code to propose to adopt it. We've taken a step toward it in adopting design guidelines. The whole purpose of form-based code and the design guidelines is to preserve the character of Falmouth. It's a different purpose than 40R. 40R is a way to bring in a block of density planning as a package. They're very different. We really shouldn't even talk about them together. They're different from one another, and they're at different stages of commitment of the planning board.
Well, I was addressing Sue's point about all the cars coming here and then going to Hyannis.
Right, but we're hoping they're our workers, and they're staying here, and they're not clogging up the bridges.
This is all very smart growth oriented. And when you think of smart growth, people can live, work, walk to work, where there's some recreation, transportation. I mean, this goes way back. So, you know, it's exciting to think of changing everything to an individual, a human, rather than a car. And that's the change in thought of going from, we've always accommodated the cars on roads and parking, and now what you're looking to do is accommodate the humans that take up that space, that walk, because that's what you want to encourage.
Because I'm just concerned we stay with the 40R in our discussion, because on our agenda, we're really violating the open meeting law if we start talking form-based
Based
code.
code, we should be
'Cause
talking
that's
about
not on our-
40R specific,
Right, because that's not on our agenda for a discussion.
not the same.
I was just going to say that most of Main Street looks like form-based code.
Yeah.
Except it has cars parked in front of it.
Right.
So if you want a good example of it, just walk down Main Street.
Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
That's fine. So as the slide points out, about 53 districts have been improved in about 43 different municipalities. This shows where some of those units have been produced. The ones that are in bold blue are actually under production. The ones in light blue have been approved, the zoning's been approved, but there hasn't necessarily been any production at those, in those towns. That includes Kingston. We finished up our stuff in 2007, approved our first phase in 2008, and then bad things happened to the economy and everyone went away, and it was never built. As I mentioned, under 40R, there's a 40S component as well. So if the impact of the development impacts your school system in a formula that the state has put together, there's additional funding through 40S to supplement impact on schools. The maximum benefit, the maximum incentive payment that this Commonwealth will provide under 40R is that $600,000. So you see places like Lakeville with the red box around it, and Lunenburg with a red box around it with an issue of $2 million and $1.2 million. Those represent the 40S dollars that have gone to those communities over and above what the initial incentive payment was. And that, unlike the 40R payments, is not a one-time payment, it's an annual payment. Every year they'll come back and look at what the school enrollment is, what the impact of the development is, and we'll continue to fund that into the future. When we first did this in 2007, the concern was, is 40S actual reality? Are people going to fund that? Is that money available? Well, to date, we've seen these two communities, Lakeville and Lunenburg, have dipped into 40S and in a big way. So these are a couple of examples of form-based code. In Bellingham, under 40R, on our former Archdiocese project, they did 18 units on 1.5 acres. Downtown Reading, this is a mixed-use TOD as transit-oriented development. They have built 53 units. There's another 135 in the pipeline. And this came out of a product of a 40B denial. Northampton, this is that other area we talked about, developing a former state hospital. This is Danvers. So Danvers is a 40R, and its design standards are form-based code. So this is a parallel to what I've been discussing here with the planning board and other folks about. Can we marry our transit-oriented development? I mean, can we marry our form-based code as the design guidelines, as the design standards under 40R? And in the case of Danvers, that's exactly what they're doing. They've taken a form-based code and said, this is what you're gonna build, this is what it's gonna look like, and it's gonna be 20 units per acre, it's gonna look like this on the front, it's gonna look like this on the side, these are how the floors are gonna look, this is how the buildings are gonna look. And the HCD has said, provided that your form-based code isn't onerous, you're requiring, you know, marble columns and things out front, they can deal with that. So Danvers is that very recent example, and it's not on the slides because we're still waiting to get this information from folks at DHCD, where they've essentially done form-based code as their design standard under 40R. So East Hampton, Lakeville, this is 1021 Kingston's Place. This is the one that I was involved in. And to give you some context, this is where the Kingston commuter rail station is, where this T is at. So the most intensive development, that high 20 units per acre, is around the train station. So as you step back from the train station, you get into a commercial node near the, in addition, mixed in with the commercial developments. And then there's a single-family district in townhouses. So this is more of that 12 unit per acre. And as we get out to the periphery, to the left of this slide, this is where you got a single-family area at, where the houses start to emulate what you might see on Alma Way already. So you look at Alma Way with those very classic sort of ranches and things like that. Those are the housing types we'll be looking to emulate as you head towards the area. The last thing you want is some hulking mass next to the folks who already live there. So the development scales up, the most intensive amount of density sort of at the center, and then as we tailor off into the town proper, we get back to those forms that we're much more comfortable with. So this was the case in Kingston. We had 730 units of housing, 50,000 square foot of retail space, 250,000 square foot of non-residential space, because frankly, people took the train to work, and we thought, well, why don't we just build offices down here, and the folks who take the train to work can just take the commuter rail to Kingston, rather than having to take the blue line to the orange line and whatever other ventures they might have in the MBTA's sphere. So this is one of those examples that I'm fairly familiar with, because I worked on it for a couple years there, where we looked at lining up those forms with what made sense in the town. So this is Marblehead. This is two mixed-use districts for a total of 64 units. Sharon, 192 units. Natick, 138 units. So as you can see, it's scalable. You don't have to necessarily go all in, but the benefits based on what you come out with, and that should come out from the design. So that's where, and I know you keep telling me stop saying form-based code, but that's where form-based code comes in at designing that density, designing that guidelines. This is how we would build those sort of things. Linfield Office Park. Easton, 40R, 280 units built, mixed use. This once again was another 40B denial. It also employed some MassWorks funds as well. MassWorks is a highly competitive grant application as well. So these are the folks who at DHCD who are regular contacts, Elaine Vanya and Bill Rayalt, who would be happy to work with us on trying to move this process forward if the town decides that it wants to do something like that. The rest of the presentation was about 40S and how 40S comports with trying to put your schools at ease if you tend to be impacted by there we go, school cost reimbursement. So there is a program they put together. It's a formula that looks at how to go about calculating the impact on your schools. Under 40S, their graphic has the formula in here. I have not delved into 40S, so I'm not as familiar with that as how the rest of the components work. But it's basically that safety net that the Commonwealth holds out there, and to the skepticism of a lot of people, they have come through and they have funded that. So as we've talked about before, we don't build a lot of units. We should. In order to get to our component that we're looking for in that HPP, we need to build a lot of units. But the trend is not that we're building more units. In fact, we're building less and less, as the chart shows. The light blue are single-family units. The black is multifamily units. There's always more single-family units in multifamily, and the numbers tend to dive. As we get back into these mixed-use developments, we see more multifamily in the areas. The next slide just talks about where Massachusetts is at as far as housing cost. We have the third highest home values in the country, only behind California and Hawaii. And as far as median rents by state go, we're number 8 behind New York, Alaska, New Jersey, Maryland, California, and Hawaii. And this is just another struggle that talks about how houses are burdened by housing costs. We hear frequently that to not be burdened by your housing costs, 30% of your income should be spent on housing. Anything over that, then you're trying to take money away from other things that you need that money for those housing costs. So we know that there's an awful lot of households that are burdened, not just on the Cape, but throughout Massachusetts. 40B, which we know has created a lot of affordable housing units, was a law created in 1969 based on a crisis of housing in Massachusetts that has gone unabated. So anything that we can bring to the game, anything we can bring to the party to help facilitate additional housing, I think is a good thing. If we can marry the efforts that we already have with some other potential that the state may offer some assistance on, I think that's worth looking at. And we're not asking anybody to vote on anything right now, but let's take the information that we've got. Let's consider if this is something that seems pragmatic, something that we want to look into, and move on with it. But the most important thing to do, and this is the last time I'm going to say it, Mr. Jones, I promise, there's a vote at town meeting on Article 3. I won't say what it's about, but we appreciate your support on that.
Thank you, Tom. I think that was really helpful to kind of walk through that and take a look at something that is somewhat new to both of these boards. Jim?
Tom, is there any restrictions on 40R, what percentage it has to be housing and mixed use?
You probably have to go to the mic.
No,
For,
there's
no,
one right
they've
there.
got, yeah, they've got a few
Okay.
hidden.
My mic was moved away. I've heard that there is a restriction that, on it. What are the restrictions if we accept this $600,000 payment?
Well, it is a housing law. So 51% of the area developed has to be for housing. 51% of the gross floor area that we're developing. You had a concern that it required, at one point, your concern was, are 50% of these units required to be 3-bedroom units? They are not. There are two things that are stated in the law, 40R and the Starter Housing Initiative. The Starter Housing Initiative requires 50% of those units to be 3-bedroom. Under 40R, you may put together the mix of units that you want.
So, but we're taking our business section and immediately turn it into 50% residential. Just want to make sure everyone understands that.
So in addition, if you do a 40B, we have been having regular conversations, passionate conversations with the state that says, we have done our housing production plan. We are looking for a mix of units when we get a 40B. We are looking at for rental opportunities. And what we're being served up on a regular basis are 3-family detached units because that's where the 40B market is going to. The state enabling agencies that fund 40Bs have basically made an agreement that says there won't be any 40Bs that don't have a 3-bedroom component to it, at least 10%.
One last question. Any of the 40Rs are shown, do they use form-based code?
Danvers does.
Just one of them?
Sometimes ideas take a while to get around. So 10% is required for any 40B development that's 3-bedroom. If we asked to say we'd like you to build a 100-unit apartment complex of 1s and 2 bedrooms, 40B is going to say 10% have to be 3 bedrooms. There's no provision under 40R that requires you to do that. It's essentially you get to decide where you want to build it. You get to decide how you want to build it. You get to decide how it's going to look through our initiative in developing the form-based code that are the design standards for it. And there's a benefit to the town because there is both affordable housing required for it, and there's some incentive payments to help, as an incentive largely to help towns adopt it and move forward.
Thank you. I mean, I think we've talked, this board, and I know planning, and we've talked about it to death, really, as a community, about affordable housing, but we just kind of keep taking these tiny little chips out of the need that's out there. And, you know, every time we get together and we think about sort of what the greatest crisis is for our community, one of them is the fact that we cannot support sort of new younger folks living here because there is nowhere for them. I mean, you know, they can't even find rentals. Even if they have some funds, there aren't even enough rentals on the market. Never mind if they're, you know, within that bracket where they're looking for something on the lower cost end. So, you know, it's just, it's interesting to just take another look at a possible way to address what is just a chronic challenge that we have. Doug and
And what
then
I like a
Charlotte?
lot about your suggestion about the 40R, with appropriate zoning put into it, it puts so much more control in our hands than the 40B does. That if we adopt this 40R with some zoning, we can actually determine what happens. With the 40Bs, we have so little control.
Plus
They
we
can
get
just
100% count on our 40B numbers.
if we do it right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Charlotte?
Last time we were discussing housing together, more or less as a group, was when the housing people were coming and making a presentation to just your board. And I think the last person who spoke that night was John Drewley. And I thought the point that he made was a good starting point for tonight. So I wonder, John, if you can recall it, if you would repeat it, and if you won't, I will.
You'll have to repeat it for me.
You said the reason we don't have more affordable housing is because as a community, we don't really want it. We would know if we really wanted it because we know how to do things when we want to do it. Look at open space. We knew to spend our own money to buy open space. We have money to spend on affordable housing. And then we would have all the control over it because we paid for it. End of John Drewley's quote. And I wonder what you think about that, because the way that open housing, the way that worked, as I understand it again from John, is that it was community preservation money and bonding. The town went out and bonded it. So much did they want open space. How much do you want affordable housing? That was John's point.
I think that was Eric Turkington's conversation too at our last housing meeting. He was talking about doing some bonding possibly, so.
And we've talked about this. I mean, I think Doug Brown brought this up at the last couple of our meetings, that we've, you know, had the same conversation, that, you know, looking at housing in the same way that we looked at, you know, open space, which was an initiative that was near and dear to the heart of many people, and we really believed it was worth that very significant, you know, investment in doing that, taking on that debt to address it. And I think Doug has sort of been beating that drum for a while about looking, along with Eric, along with John. I mean, you know, I think it's out there that there's that question: do you do something large and big and, you know?
Large and big and locally controlled. One of the problems with 40B is the same problem with 40R. You do this, maybe you get the money if you put in enough units, not likely with the amount of land we have. But okay, they give you some money, but you have no control over who's going to be living there. They might not be our workers. They might not be our residents. They might not be our older people who want to downsize. They might not be the people that we bring to mind when we think about what we need. You've just lost control of all that. And I think it's one of the reasons why we don't go forward, and we somehow don't discuss that, but maybe we should.
Tom, and then
I was gonna say, one of the components that allow you to put a unit on the subsidized housing inventory is because there's been a marketing plan and a lottery. You can identify a local need. You can stipulate a local need up to 70%. It's sometimes for that local need, but you have to bake that into what you're doing. But you cannot simply create affordable housing for the people who live in Falmouth. And to be on the state subsidized housing inventory, it has to be a broad marketing plan. We've heard stories about these folks on Main Street, how they have these 2 affordable units that they can't fill. Well, they're gonna have to go back out and do a better job at marketing these units outside of the area. I don't know what they marketed, I wasn't involved in that. But in order to be on the subsidized housing inventory, and to make any progress on that line, then those things have to be developed and through the lottery, where you have people who aren't necessarily your neighbors, but are gonna be your new neighbors.
right, I mean, that's what we actually need. We need an influx of new, not just young, all across the board, but in particular, younger folks who invest in the community, work in the community, raise their family here, are sort of, you know, filling the many needs that we have for, I mean, if you talk to any employer, it is very hard to find staff, particularly in the summer when you're gearing up, we are literally bringing people in from across the world to fill, and that's a wonderful thing for, sort of the experience of our community, but we have to do that, and it's very unstable for business owners. That's, a challenge every single year. There are costs associated with that above and beyond just employing individuals in terms of, the visa programs, getting people in here. I mean, I don't think we need to be insular. I think we want to invite new people into the community. That's what creates the vibrancy. And so I guess my concern isn't as much about who lives in any of these buildings, but just that we have a range of living options that calls to people sort of in different stages of their economic and career, sort of trajectory. John, and then.
So we've just started working on an apartment bylaw, just the very first rough draft of it, similar to the 40R, but without the restrictions of 51% being housing. This would be 100% housing. And we're trying to do it in a way that it would be similar to a 40B, but be done by right, be done in the districts that the town wants them done in, and 100% of units would count toward the SHI. But it'd be all apartments, an apartment bylaw, so, but we've just started working on that, so.
Great. Sam and then Peter?
Yeah, I think, to Charlotte's comment about how we're so willing to invest in open space, but not in redevelopment or into affordable housing units or complexes. I think the form-based code actually helps us there because people don't like investing in something they can't conceive of or see. And so if you have a model for what it's going to look like, I think people are going to be far more inclined to say, yes, this community does need affordable housing. That looks like it's perfectly acceptable. In fact, it could be very attractive. So I think the form-based coding is a kind of a way of addressing that uncertainty that people have in their minds. And of course, they are quick to point out urban developments that have failed in terms of higher density units. They're entirely different environments. It's nothing like a Falmouth at all, but they want to see the worst case, if you will, rather than see something that could be quite attractive and could, in fact, if it's done in a community development kind of way, be a very attractive neighborhood to live in.
Right. Peter, and then I know Doug had his hand up. Do you have your hand up too, Pam? Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, the Housing Production Plan recommended that we work on our zoning. That was one of the recommendations. And in terms of, does the town really want affordable housing? I guess I would say, we'll learn as much about that based on how these zoning initiatives move forward as we do about how much money we can put into it. Because, I think we may be on track, subject to, Community Preservation Committee and town meeting. But where the CPC seems to be leading is, 1.2 million per year, perhaps, something like that?
Correct. Yeah, 1.35.
That's a pretty good chunk of money. It might be as much as a community like this can reasonably do on a recurring basis. It's not nearly going to be enough. So that's why this zoning is so much more important, because it's so much more scalable. And just quickly on the bonding piece, a concern that I would have about that is $1 million per year may be about our capacity to manage that outflow of money. There's a lot, housing is very complicated, and there's a lot that goes into each of those projects. And there's a lot that goes into zoning too, but once you have zoning, you have a whole zoning area that potentially may stimulate private investment and private affordable housing. And we're gonna need a lot more of that kind of affordable housing if we're gonna, impact our situation.
Doug and then Pam?
I think it's somewhat true what John had mentioned last year and what Charlotte just reminded us of, that in many cases Falmouth doesn't want affordable housing because they don't want it pushed on them. They don't want a Little Pond Landing with 168 units in a white cedar swamp, and they don't want Liberty, what's the name of it?
Liberty Green.
Yeah, Liberty Green, because it was a massive superstructure which is overbearing. And this is what we're faced with, these developer incentivized ideas that kind of shove it down our throats. So I'm pretty interested in this, this redevelopment plan, because it's something more palatable. We can get a lot of units and not have it be a big monstrosity. So I'm pretty hopeful for this.
Okay.
you know, it's something that I think Falmouth has been very hesitant to look at, which is, and I've probably said this 100 times, but a developer like an Avalon that comes into a community, puts up 160 units with a community little community center, a pool. They make it a livable community, and usually within a transportation hub, usually within walking distance to medical facilities or whatever. But I don't know, I know the wastewater issue is a big issue, although they do their own package treatment plants, large package treatment plants. But I think it's been, I moved here 4 years ago, and probably 3.5 years ago, I bent Sue's ear and said, couldn't we do something out of the box here in Falmouth if we really want to look at affordable housing? And I just think it's a different paradigm, because we can't expect these developers to come in and they build 7 units, they build 20 units or 30 units, and they say this is one of the worst towns to build in because it takes so long to get anything going. So I walked through that medical building, I guess it was an old nursing home, and I just stood in the middle of that building and thought, what a waste. There are all these individual rooms that have a sink and a toilet, and maybe they share a shower, and yes, retrofitting it to accommodate individuals. But as Bill Zammer said, he has this housing, and people have a bed, and they have a shower, and they share a kitchen. And we don't, I have to say, that building could accommodate so many people. And it could create, there could be a pharmacy, there could be a medical facility, there could be so much there, and because it's an X, you could take and do them gradually, but builders don't want to come here because it's just so onerous to build here. So why not take a structure, and Christian Valley said that at our little summit, was that take something that exists and let us redo it to make a multifamily housing unit. But that building could accommodate so many people, and I don't remember what they're asking for it now, but there's just such a need for especially our summer workforce that people have so much trouble filling, except for people like Bill that provide.
Right, and, you know, that's been a challenge for a really long time.
Didn't we look into buying that? It's not for sale?
It's for sale.
Tom and then John. Bob, did you have your hand up?
No.
So what will take time is to do things right. And I know we're very eager to move forward with doing things quickly to try to offset some of the impact that we're having in the loss of housing and the sheer number of 40Bs that we're receiving here in town. But if we take our time to do it right by letting the form-based code inform how things will look in the Davis Strait area, and then we add onto that the affordable component and the incentives, we'll do it right. And under 40R, there's a requirement that says expedited permitting, that you'll permit things within, I believe it's 180 days of an application. And the way you do that is because so much of the development is baked into the zoning. It's gonna look like this. It's gonna have this many floors. It's gonna have this many units. So when you bring that to the table, there is that certainty from the development community that goes, this is what we're gonna have to build, and we can run a number on that to see how that's gonna play out for us. So the certainty of knowing what you're going to build through the design standards of form-based code, and the fact that under permitting, you've got to expedite permitting under 40R in short order. One of the things I really didn't dwell on very much is that the appeals process. So if someone wants to do a subdivision, they can appeal that. Someone wants to do a special permit, they can appeal that. Whether it's for the dome, whether it's a 40B, they can appeal that. Under 40R, the appeal process requires the person who's going to appeal to post a bond. You can't just go out and hire, no offense to the council at the table here, you just can't go out and hire a lawyer and have them start shooting paperwork in the courts. You you're actually gonna have to post a bond for the potential damages for what you're appealing under this. So that's why it's critically important that the design that you have is what you have, and the standards are what you have, that allows that certainty and allows people to know what we're gonna build and expedite in a proper manner, and that maybe take away some of that reputation that Falmouth is a difficult town to develop in. I can tell you, since I've been here, I've been trying to do things as we do things, and I've upset a few folks in the development community. But that's only because we're just trying to impose upon the development community those things that have always been in our regulations. So we're sort of having a bit of a get to know each other here in the community. And I think that while I've heard the same thing from afar, I think by moving forward and updating our zoning, both through the zoning recodification that we're working on, that we hope to have, not at this town meeting, but hopefully give me a hint, April town meeting for recodification. So we'll be able to clean up our zoning. In the areas of Davis Straits, our zoning for that area is just gonna go away. That zoning won't comport to that. You'll be looking at the form-based code and the 40R as the zoning for that. And it won't be our typical zoning. Our design guidelines we're working on are gonna apply to all the other places you're building outside of that district. So with time and effort, we will have a product that I think that the development community will recognize. These work out best, quite frankly, if you have a developer who's looking at the property. And we look at, is it Kinco, Jim, the folks who own the Staples Shopping Center? They are the folks who are building these things in their other developments elsewhere. So if they're looking at redeveloping their other developments, those are certainly people we need to have at the table as we look forward in developing whatever sort of zoning we're gonna put out there. Because if you have zoning and it doesn't employ a conversation with the development community, you've essentially got some zoning that's frankly not gonna be used as frequently as it should. If you're gonna spend the time and the effort on that, you've gotta have that outreach, and that's part of the funding on Article 3, is to bring those people on to do that outreach, to do those drawings, and to do those things to put us on sound footing.
Did I miss somebody? Yeah, John.
I would just like to summarize that as a board, we are starting to look at different venues to increase housing in the town of Falmouth, which will have to be approved by town meeting.
And I think that's that's really the question that Eric and everybody else is, you've been asking about whether or not we really want affordable housing. I actually think that the answer for the public is yes and no. I mean, most people, when there is an affordable housing project near them, the outcry is enormous, and many times really just puts a dent in what that project, the real value, or it makes the development incredibly onerous for the developers. Because I don't think we've done a good job, and this is sort of as a community, so it's sort of all boards, all staff, we haven't done a good job really talking about what affordable housing means. Part of it is what it looks like, and sort of how people conceive of it, and the real value and need for it. Because people will say we need more places for people to live, and then the minute a project is proposed, they just want to shut it down. And so I think, the idea that we could, right now where we stand, the idea we could go out and bond, even if we were going to do that as a town, I think the hue and cry would be immense from people saying this is what we're going to put our money into. Because we consistently just have that pushback.
I think it might also be because we haven't made a linkage that we really should. Both transportation and housing are land use issues. It's all in how you use the land. And if we don't narrow down where we want affordable housing and connect it to transportation, we're making a big mistake. Supposing we scatter a whole lot of high-density affordable housing up off Route 151, where you drive along and look at all that land and say, wow, we could stick a bunch of stuff in there. Well, you're sticking an awful lot of more cars on all those roads. You've created a tremendous transportation problem of where are those cars gonna go when they come downtown to shop. You've got more parking needs. You've put them in the wrong place rather than putting them close to the services that they need. Infill is the way to go for any of the high-density things. Not just because of the sewerage. We keep connecting sewerage to density, but we need, I think, to connect transportation to density too, and keep them close to the things that, so they can walk to Stop and Shop or Shaw's. They can walk to, no longer Friendlies, but they can walk to the services that are nearby. They can get to the library. They can get to the schools, infill. And the whole idea of smart growth is to do exactly that. We don't have to invent this. We just have to apply it every time we think about housing and transportation, so that people hearing about affordable housing, oh my God, they might stick it out at Locust Field, which was probably a mistake. No, they wouldn't. They'd be putting it down where you decided you wanted to have it, and you'd stick to it.
But just to push back on that, I guarantee you, if right now we said these two boards have voted on a 250, or make it smaller, 100, room apartment development, we're gonna go put it somewhere here within exactly those confines that you're talking about, near RTA, there would be significant pushback, because people have a image of what affordable housing means, and it's wrapped up with lots of sort of negative connotations, and I think we have to do a better job of, really highlighting the successful affordable housing projects that we have had in this town that, people may not even conceive of them in that way, and we just have to do that better, because yes, you're right. I mean, it is, the whole idea of all of this is trying to develop in a smart way, and that takes into transportation, access to all of the facilities people need, reduction in traffic, but there's also the component is we have to have the community on board to support those projects and not sort of stop, whether it's private or some kind of partnership, stop that development or tie it up in litigation, so that the next developer says, I'm not coming, I've got a great concept and I've got good backing, but I'm not going to Falmouth because this project's 3 years in the works and they're still, being appealed.
That's Sam's point. They need to see how it's going to look, and that's form-based zoning. Has pictures.
Yes, Paul?
I think you're raising a very valuable point, and at the Housing Summit recently, Carla Fioroni did a nice job of trying to indicate who are these people of affordable housing, because there's a misunderstanding who these people are. They're people who work in our community. They're the people who are firemen and teachers and people like that who need the housing affordable. It's not a project by any means like that, like an inner city project would be, but it's people who need the kinds of houses that we provide, that provide services to all of us. So I thought you did a good job beginning that educational process, and I think we have to continue that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the underpinnings of some of that is exactly what she was getting to there. Yeah, Doug?
So I think this long-range planning is great, but we also need to work on current issues, like, I'd like to look into what the status of our existing housing. A lot of it's old, and I wonder how many units are down, how often, in those older buildings, and if there's some funding required for that. And another thing I'd like to consider is, I think a lot of people look into doing the accessory apartments. A lot of times it would involve a basement apartment, but then the egress issues become expensive. And I think a lot of those don't happen, because sometimes people wait a little too late to get a little behind before they realize the need for that additional income. So they may be not in a position to take a large loan with a long-range plan of an apartment remodel. I looked at one the other day and I said, the way, it's like halfway finished already. I said, the way this is set up, you really need to put a egress window in the middle of that big room that you've already pretty much finished. And the person was just like, that's just not in the cards. I just can't swing it right now. There's no way I'm gonna get a loan. And I wonder if there should be some kind of a program where we can give some kind of guaranteed loan, some kind of low interest or no interest fund that's there that can help these people and get these accessory apartments in place, because it's a great idea, the accessory apartment thing, but there's a lot of barriers that I think we should probably try to look at how we can help and work through those.
Some of the local banks have just started a program that can take our accessory apartment bylaw and they'll finance it.
Oh, yeah.
That it's already, that exact banks are already coming in that direction. So if people do the proper planning and they find out what they want to do first and arrange their financing, once you pour the cement, it's kind of too hard to make changes, but that's already in place. Some of the banks just announced it, I just heard about it the last few days.
Good.
So that,
Maybe providing that information through, through planning, through, all the places they're gonna come to.
here's all the banks you can borrow your money from. They have $50,000 ready to go.
Actually, in our correspondence at the planning board meeting the other day, I'm gonna guess we've had a lot they run together, but we actually had a notification about this home program to help with low-interest loans, where essentially you take the loan, you don't have to pay back the loan until you sell the house. And so this is information we got the other day. If it's not on our website already, because we talked about putting on the website, it will be shortly.
Yeah, it's up to $50,000, 0 interest.
Pay it back when you sell.
Pay it back when you sell the house.
Great.
And what better incentive for a couple or an individual who is getting older and maybe want to think a little bit ahead about, gee, I wouldn't mind having somebody else in the house. And it provides income. And what a bonus for people to be able to do that without looking, Doug, as you said, how much is that gonna cost me for an egress for my basement?
That's here now. That money's available.
We've had local housing groups come before the planning board with land deal swaps that get really complicated because of road widths and things like that. They're spending money on lawyers. They're spending all this time, to me, wasting time. And I would like to see groups like that buy existing housing stock that's on the market. I know I've been a construction supervisor for Habitat for 25 years, and we provide funding that we get through fundraising and grants and all that, supplements half the cost of the house, because we end up selling the houses for half of what it costs us to build them. And if some of these organizations would look into that avenue of funding existing housing, it might take some of the pressure off of the fact that a lot of our housing are being bought by second homeowners, which is driving up the cost of real estate here. It takes housing off the market. The old days, I remember people would do the winter summer. I have friends living in mansions in the wintertime. That isn't available anymore.
Yeah.
And we need a lot of tools in this toolbox, and I'm not saying that buying existing housing is gonna solve it all. Habitat for Humanity building 1 or 2 houses here or there isn't gonna solve it all, but I think something that we should add to the toolbox and something to look into, that we buy existing housing stock that we could then turn over to some entity that has an affordable housing component to it.
Yeah. I think one, I want to just sort of be cognizant a little bit of the time, but one of the things that we had talked about was the potential of, sort of in the new year, picking one of these things, whether it's working on our LIP and coming up with sort of a real process, for folks to go through, and getting together again and sort of brainstorming and coming up with a product, right? That is something that moves the process forward in a way that allows all of these various entities that are working on some of these issues to actually, have a clearer path forward, or a clearer path of, what's expected, what's anticipated. The thing that we've heard a couple times from individuals who've come here is that, every time, for folks who do affordable housing, every time they come through the process, it's a little different, right? And they're not quite sure exactly, what they do next. And then that wastes a lot of time, and it does waste money on sometimes attorneys or the funds that they're paying to get projects ready. So, having some guidelines, clearer guidelines in place to the extent that we can do that, I think is something that these two boards, could work on and put something in place that's helpful. We keep getting that ask from, Linda has said it, Karen Bissonette has said it, every time they've come before us, and just, when we had a discussion a few months ago, that was sort of both of those individuals who've worked on, a number of projects have made it pretty clear that that was something that would be helpful to them. So, I don't know, maybe in the new year we can look at that. Yeah, Pat.
There are a couple of things I think that we have to look at. Definitely there is going to be rezoning. There has to be rezoning. That's what we're looking at for the whole reset program there too. We may be looking at 40R. I think we have to understand the details of 40R before we jump into it, because the devil is always in the details. But I also wonder, the Salt Sea Apartments. I think you could get, if we rezoned that area, I think you could get more apartments there. And I think they could be not only elderly apartments. We could look at that, and I don't know what it takes, because I don't know what the covenants are or anything on those, but you look at them, they're kind of like duplexes, ranch styles. If you went up to a two-story and you had younger people living on the upper floors, elderly people living on the lower floors, you get affordability, you get mixed age groups. You've got enough land there that you can have playground space for the children of the young families. And I think that may be, as Bob likes to put it, the low-hanging fruit, that something could be done maybe a little bit more rapidly to make a change in this town. Like I said, I don't know what the zoning is or anything like that. Don't even know what the ownership is. Does the town own the Salt Sea Apartments? Do you know?
It's the Housing Authority.
The Housing Authority, okay. You've got, is it Rosemarin Drive up on the hill there? I've never even driven up there, so I'm talking without knowledge, but it seems to me that these entities could make a difference more rapidly than what we're talking about with changing under the reset area for form-based code, all of which can happen simultaneously. But the reset is probably going to take, as Peter said, 5 years, 10 years, maybe more. It's going to be redone, and it is going to be rezoned, it has to be. But let's look at doing something a little bit different, and that can happen more quickly. And maybe that's what we come to the bonding issue, too. So just threw that into the water here.
I have just one quick
Pam,
question.
and then
What do you
Beth.
do you ever do tax taking here in Falmouth? When a house has fallen way
Yes.
behind?
Not over there.
Very reluctantly.
Well, I'm
Not very
sure,
often.
no one does it with joy in their heart, but
Yes.
Yeah, on rare occasions, yes.
On rare occasions and usually undevelopable parcels is the most typical that we would take.
I mean, it's a great source of affordable housing if you get those properties and they're not in horrible disrepair. And you can put, I mean, 'cause some of these houses, I don't know how one family lives in them, but
I mean, how big they are?
they're huge, huge.
So I don't remember the last time we made any kind of investment into our housing authority properties. And I know that they get federal funding for repairs and maintenance, but I would be interested to learn, maybe Linda might come or somebody from that organization and update us onto what their current conditions are and how many units are vacant due to disrepair and so forth.
Housing Authority is different from the Housing Corp.
Right.
Housing Authority is
Bobby.
Bobby Richards. Has
So,
their
yeah,
office
we
is
could have-
next to West Marine.
Okay?
It's entirely different organization.
Well, whoever's the one that's running all these
Yeah,
old
so maybe we
buildings.
can invite Bobby to come and just sort of have a further conversation about, some of those questions folks are asking about what does that stock look like, and, just giving us a sense of any
Sure.
opportunity that might be there,
Maybe
short
we
or
could-
long term.
Maybe we could maximize some more opportunities there.
And I think this is something where the planning board should be specifically notified when you're going to have that, so that we're continuing this conversation.
Could be a future joint meeting.
Could be, yep, in the new year. Yep.
Mhm.
Well, unless anyone has any other, I think we've, come out with some action items in terms of both complete streets and the committee kind of being reconstituted. And thank you, Tom, that was really helpful, I think, to everybody to just sort of start thinking about the possibility of 40R and then some of these other suggestions that folks have had. Bless you. So, just a huge thank you. I know it's always hard to schedule. We're getting ready for town meeting in 2 weeks, which is just unbelievable that we're doing it so soon. So thank you so much for all of you for being here and for putting the presentations together and to just really focusing on bringing stuff to this board's attention, like that committee, and really, focusing on complete streets so we can kind of move the ball forward in a way that's meaningful. And, hopefully we'll be doing it again in just a few months to maybe we'll delve deeper into some of these issues around affordable housing, so.
And I just want to say, I don't get to do any of this stuff without the staff behind me that does
Yes.
such great work to help put these things together. So I don't do things, we do things.
So I move we adjourn.
Happy to have them.
Second.
Oh, sorry, hold on, Paul.
I make a motion, we adjourn.
Oh. Well, let me do it for this, board, all those.
Patriots are
Just
winning
a point of order,
24-0.
just a point of order. On the agenda, it says the next planning board is November 5th.
That's not true.
Is that true?
No, it's
Where does
tomorrow
it say
night.
that on the agenda?
It's not on our agenda.
Oh, okay, I think so.
Planning board,
On there,
planning board
so-
tomorrow night.
Yes.
I'll
So-
have better seating for you guys tomorrow
Okay,
night,
I just
promise.
wanted that to be known, that our next planning board meeting is October 23rd, which is
This is a
tomorrow
great
We're
night.
just gonna vote all those in favor, because we had a motion to adjourn
Aye.
in a second.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
Thank you.
Slide this around the